Casey Muratori is a programmer and educator who specializes in video game engine research and development. Many upstart coders know him for his Handmade Hero series, where he documents the whole cloth creation of a game and its engine from scratch. Casey, welcome to the No Frauds Club. We're going to start by asking you about your journey as an educator. For example, I know you've been working on this programming course called Star Code Galaxy, and I read somewhere that you described this as focusing on fundamentals that apply to all programs and in all languages, which is a pretty big statement to make, I would say, especially if people are familiar with the modern state of program education. So if you had to conceptualize some core principles of coding, is there an immediate example that jumps to mind? Is there one that immediately jumps out at you that you would cover inside this course?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for having me on the program.
Yeah,
sure. I'm excited to see. I know I'm one of the earlier guests here on this program. I'm excited to see where you go with it. Let me talk about the educator thing real quick. So just to be clear, that's sort of an accidental role. I didn't really intend to be a programming educator, and I think most of that just came out of the fact that programming education is a bit anemic nowadays and doesn't really it doesn't really do a good job communicating a lot of the skills that I think programmers should have, and that pretty much any programmer who came up when I came up would have had. So I see there's kind of like a bit of a lost sense of what a programmer actually does and what the fundamentals of programming actually are. And so I've really more or less just I was doing in my spare time some of the stuff, like you said, Handmade Hero, and eventually it just got to the point where it was like, okay, lots of people obviously want this. I get requests for tutorials and introductory materials and books and all this stuff all the time. Like, I need to just do this. Like, it's obvious that people want this, and I do think people should have access to high quality learning materials for programming. I think it has very negative consequences for society if we don't have good resources for learning programming, because computers control an increasing amount of our lives. So having good software is going to be important, increasingly important. And so, with Star Code Galaxy, really all I was going to do is say, all right, I'm actually going to sit down and figure out how do we actually do good educational materials, and we'll see how that goes. That was what I was thinking about it. To your specific question, which is what is an example of a fundamental of programming? So the reason that I think there are things such that are true fundamentals of programming is because in general, if you look at what a computer actually does, you look at a CPU or a GPU or even an AI co-processing style unit, which are kind of more in vogue these days. There are very specific, very simple operations that these things can do. And so when we talk about what a programmer does, anything else you might want to say, we should all understand that at the end of the day is what is going to be running our program. And the extent to which you understand how it will run your program has real world effects. If I literally have no idea what happens when I ask you to add two numbers together in a particular language I'm programming in, you are missing a very fundamental piece of programming. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but that is the case of, say, a JavaScript programmer. Most JavaScript programmers don't even know how the numbers are represented when they say 5 plus 7. They have no idea, right? It's completely opaque to them. They've never even thought about the fact that there is a real device that actually has to execute that operation. And so when I talk about fundamentals of programming, that's what I mean. A person who understands the fundamentals of programming, it doesn't really matter what programming language. When I program in JavaScript, I have a rough idea of exactly what's going to happen when it encounters 5 plus 7 as an expression. I know if those are constants, it's going to evaluate them in the compile time part and probably fold it into something, what it's actually doing at JIT. If it can't do that, depending on how it's going to have to fetch them, I know it's going to have to do these certain operations in order to, right? There's all these fundamentals. How did I know that? I'm barely a JavaScript programmer. I don't spend much time in it. The reason I know all those things is because I know what a computer does. And so I can map whatever ends up happening in any language that you show me. I know the rough set of things that would have to happen in order for that to occur. So when I talk about fundamentals, that's what I mean. Understanding what is actually required of the computer to carry out something that you tell it to do. And I think this pays many benefits. The least of which actually is performance, which is what happens when you can sort of make intelligent decisions about what to do based on how the computer can do them. But there's way more than that. But I've gone too long on one question, so we'll leave it there.
That's okay. We can pick that thread up in a moment, actually. So you did mention that computers are controlling an ever-increasing amount of things, which I think is an interesting point of discussion by itself. One of the things that, programming, the product of a programmer controls is even, webcam technology. And I did just notice that during some of your answer there, your webcam was freezing for extended periods of time in between it. So I wasn't sure if that was something you were aware of or how to fix it exactly.
Oh, no. Well,
if it's just a tech issue, we can roll with it. But I was just curious.
If you want, we could use something other than Discord. I think that's just Discord, probably because Discord's running in a browser, would be my guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Do you want me to just record separately and send you the video?
We could use that as a backup if you wouldn't mind, if that's not too much of a hassle.
Yeah, I literally just click one button.
Perfect. Okay.
All right.
So in that case, we're back to talking about what computers themselves actually control. So it's interesting that you bring that up as like an initial point, because I feel like a lot of people, especially those who are not initiated and who don't believe that maybe it's that much of a big deal to focus on whether or not their program performs well, or whether or not their program is written to a good specification, we'll say, as far as, adhering to some of these fundamentals that you just explained, but also that you're talking about within Star Code Galaxy. It's like these programmers who are coming into it, I think a lot of them, unfortunately, it's just like the environment that constrains them most of the time, where they probably didn't, they probably weren't around early enough in the lifespan of programming to understand all of the things they had to. Like programmers back then, there's famous talks all over the place where, back in the good old days of programming, you could only do so much. And that's one of the reasons why programming was more important. Or also, obviously, hardware hadn't advanced as much. So there's only so many things the hardware itself can manage. And so that meant that we did have to really be mindful of every instruction, or maybe a little bit later on in the hardware lifecycle, you could say you didn't have to be mindful of every individual instruction, but you had to be, maybe mindful of super heavy compression, which nobody uses anymore, especially in video games, which is why there's like, oh yeah, one game is 250 gigabytes, or there's other games that like each patch adds more and more because they can't figure out how to delete it from the Unity pack or something. There's all sorts of crazy examples of that going on in the video games industry specifically, but I'm sure it also extends to software writ large. So I wanted to talk about basically, I mean, it's tough for me to empathize with somebody who is coming at this and being like, well, why should we care about whether or not, computers are running good code? Because I've already been convinced, like I'm already, bought hook, line and sinker about the idea that, yeah, this is 100% a big issue. And the more issues we stack onto it, like there could be real world consequences. There already have been in some cases. Every time airplane software malfunctions, or, healthcare software ends up going down, or like one of the reasons apparently there's like Windows XP or even older operating systems running in a lot of healthcare environments because they're worried about the downtime of Windows Update, which funnily enough, I did have to spam click postpone update earlier before we started this. Another case of software.
I mean, everyone does.
Really well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Is there some case that is in a real world environment that like encapsulates that? If you had to convince somebody who wasn't initiated and who didn't buy into this model, this line of thinking that software is super important, if it doesn't run well, then we as like a society, as a civilization, we could actually be at risk, because people will initially interact with that concept and they'll be like, well, there's absolutely no way. Like, how could that possibly be happening? This is just a program. Like, how could this endanger us as maybe not as a species, but as a society as we currently involve? So is there some obvious case that like really sells that principle for you, or do you think it's more of an understanding of how global computer is and computation programming actually is?
Well, I guess what I would say is I don't want to oversell it, meaning I usually am not really out to convince people whether they should care more about software quality or not. So we can talk about that in a second, but I'd rather say something as a caveat earlier, which is in line with the fact that I said my role as an educator is largely happenstance. That should tell you something about my degree of desire to like proselytize this particular point. What I more am interested in doing is talking to people who, like me, believe there to be a problem and provide them with solutions to that problem. I don't necessarily feel like it's my role or my desire to convince people who think that that's wrong that they have to think it's right. I think there are strong arguments you can make, and maybe we can go over some of those as well, but I guess I almost don't care. Like, in my mind, I don't think it's important that we convince everybody to think the same way about software. I don't know that that's particularly productive. So, to me, it's more like I want to make sure that programmers who care about these things can get the education they need. Programmers who don't want to care about these things, I'm not really interested in forcing their head into the water, saying drink it. Like, it's like, no, like, if they don't want to, they don't have to. But as far as why I think it's important, if we want to just call it more of a personal observation, I think it's twofold. One, like you said, there are some obvious examples, and they're getting worse. I mean, we literally have planes crashing now due to poor software. That was an actual thing that happened twice. There's obviously things like all of the cybersecurity nightmares that are happening, people getting their data hacked. That we're getting things like ransomware. The Swiss cheese nature of we just piled a bunch of crap on top of each other and gave it to you, and we have no idea about the security level of really any of the things that are involved here, and we just wait for CVEs to pop up and then we patch them. You can see how at-risk society is just by how much of this stuff happens all the time. Name a corporation that hasn't had a major breach of their credit card data and all these other sorts of things. Everyone gets these in their mailbox. They're like, oh, bad news, folks. Where we live, we literally had to stop using online bill pay for the trash service because they got hacked. And they had to shut it down for 3 months, right? So, I mean, I think we could make arguments and we could sit here and debate the finer points of it. But I mean, like, if the ubiquitous nature of software falling apart isn't sort of evident to you, I don't know that there's much I'm going to be able to say, because it's in the news all the time. It's Windows Update rebooting your machine all the time. It's I can't get the PlayStation to talk to my television. It's all of these things that you experience in real life happening. And those are bugs. Right, that's one category. I think performance also kind of speaks for itself in ways that people don't understand either. If performance were not a problem, why are you buying a new phone? Like, if all your stuff was as fast as you needed it to be, why can't you just use an iPhone 3? Is it just because you wanted a higher resolution camera? If it wasn't for the higher resolution camera, you would just go back and use an iPhone 3. That would be plenty fast enough for you. I think anyone who tried to boot Facebook on an iPhone 3 would be so sad today, because it could like barely scroll and things, right? And so I don't think it's true. People are constantly upgrading to faster hardware. So that tells me you aren't satisfied with the performance, because otherwise you wouldn't need to buy these things, right? So I don't know. So to me, it's sort of self-evident, but if it isn't self-evident to somebody and they don't find those examples compelling, I don't think it's, I don't want to beat them over the head. I don't want to browbeat people. I don't want to be out there yelling and screaming at people. I'd rather just complain about the thing, and if you find that compelling, come talk to me. If you don't, that's totally cool. I'm not going to come to your Twitter feed and yell at you. I'm not going to, I don't think that's appropriate. So
we'll talk about yelling at Twitter feeds later on in this little conversation teaser for you. Okay. But I did want to talk about specifically the Handmade Hero project, right, is something that you started a long time ago now, or at least relative to what most people would expect out of programming projects. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, like, from what I've consumed so far in preparation for this, it seems like there were a good amount of things initially that came with the territory of booting up and literally making everything from scratch so that you could run this game. So were there things that, like, that lessons you learned, maybe something that's more broad than just programming, but it's okay as well if it's a specific programming task that you had no idea how to do, or you only had like a basic idea of how to do, and by going through the Handmade Hero project, like, you yourself were able to learn? Because like one of the things that I feel like happens a lot of the times, especially with these larger projects, is that, people can forget, especially if they're not even the ones who were doing the larger project, they're just an audience member in one of these Handmade Hero streams or something to that effect. They might forget all of the different, hoops you had to jump through, all the different lessons you have to learn in order to get past some of the initial challenges or even some of the later challenges that came in. One of the streams, I think the most recent one on the channel as of the time we're recording this, is about like stepping through some debugging about some of the diagrams that we're running and the real-time debugging that you were doing. I think this was in the month of October, so that might refresh your memory. So one of the things that this gets to me personally is like, people assume, and from the conversations I've had with people who have followed what I've done, and obviously it's a much smaller number of people who have followed what you've done, is that they assume that you already knew all of this stuff and you were just going through the motions of doing it. And I think this is an interesting conversation point to try to dispel that, because they forget that you yourself are all constantly in a state of learning and improving over time, even if it might be like maybe you are at the asymptote of that particular curve. Maybe you are towards the top of how good C++ will let you be, right? In this example. So were there some examples of like really salient lessons that you think will stick with you that maybe, dovetail with the fundamentals of programming? Or was it actually more just like, oh yeah, I'm just doing my stuff and I already knew most of this stuff? Because it feels like there was probably some hoops you had to jump through that maybe you weren't initially prepared for.
So I guess what I'll say first is, again, Handmade Hero wasn't really designed as an educational stream. That, again, was kind of an accident. And so, yeah, I mean, the goal of the stream was to show struggling with programming, not to show doing something that I already could just type in from scratch. Obviously, there are some things that I just type in from scratch on stream because they happen to be things that I've done so many times before that it would be impossible for me to screw them up now, just for my sheer repetition and the fact that they are not particularly interesting, right? Like some minutia of how to open a window or register a window class is not that interesting and is not particularly difficult if you've done it a bunch of times, right? But the vast majority of other things in programming, and also one of the reasons that I find it hard to relate to people who don't think there's value in doing things new, who are just like, why don't you just always use the Unreal Engine or something? It's like, well, it's because I don't think people have a realistic understanding of just how primitive everything we do is right now. So the goal of Handmade Hero was to show me trying to do various things and seeing what I come up with on the spot. It's very much, it's designed to be something that shows mistakes, that shows debugging, that shows making poor choices and realizing that you make the poor choice, coming back to it. And that, I think, is really the only real value of the series, honestly, to me, is showing that act of programming. So I don't really think it matters. If people want to learn something from Handmade Hero, I don't think it matters that much what they watch. Just watching a little bit of it is where the value is. This is how a real programmer who worked on lots of real technology that's in lots of real games does stuff. And there's no mystery to it. There's just a lot of work and paying attention and trying to remember what you're doing and what your choices are and observing their effects. And so I would say most things on Handmade Hero were not things that I knew exactly what I was going to do before I started. There also was a separate benefit that I wasn't expecting, and that is some domain experts watch Handmade Hero from time to time. And those domain experts know more than I do about some, particular aspect of programming. And so there were a number of times in the series where I actually got to benefit from somebody who basically said, oh, by the way, here's this thing you didn't know about. The Intel, it's a shame that I'm mentioning this because it doesn't exist anymore, but the Intel Architecture Code Analyzer, I didn't even know about. And someone mentioned on stream, they're like, you could use this to count the instructions so you don't have to do it yourself. And I was like, oh, wow. I didn't know. So, there were times when I got to learn from people who were experts in some domain that I am not an expert in. And that was a really nice side effect of just the act of streaming that had nothing to do with other than the fact that I was streaming. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, there's a bit of a community building there almost, where you start to get people who are attempting to help you solve the problems that you're facing. And Maybe that is,
Yes.
that might be even a resource that is, like you said, localized to the act of streaming and having enough interest in that, as opposed to what the average person who was trying to follow along perhaps would come in. So yeah,
Yes.
would you say that, like, you were talking earlier about how Handmade Hero, obviously the educational aspect, you almost fell into your lap. And so you did Handmade Hero not as primarily an educational resource, but and in some ways, I think I've heard you say this before, that if maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like showing that a developer can do these things is almost part of the value of the exercise as well, right? Like the fact that you can actually program something from scratch, the fact that you can build your own engine, documenting that online and then having people be able to follow along if they want to, is like, that's almost a second order effect. But the purpose of it in some ways is to say, hey, game engine, the idea of programming your own game engine, this is important. This is something we all had to do once upon a time. And it's not something that we should just be happy to dismiss, because there's going to be some things that, we're finding out on our team specifically. There's stuff that Unreal Engine and Unity Engine just can't do. There's stuff that you need to be able to build up from yourself. And it would really help if, like we said earlier, you knew some of these first principles of programming, because then you can solve the problems that you come in and you can fix the mistakes that you make in the early stages, right? So would you say that that's like a correct assessment of one of the main reasons for Handmade Hero existing?
I mean, it's a post hoc reason, though,
Okay.
much like the educational reason. In other words, I, again, didn't know, and maybe I should have known, but I didn't know there were so many people who were waiting for that. So I have heard from, at this point, it's probably in the thousands. I took my email address off the website and I still get them now at the business address. But I've heard from so many people where the story is much more about just that foot in the door, right? Because, like I said, Handmade Hero is not really an educational resource in that way. It's me actually doing the programming. It's not a series of lessons. But it turns out that what that initial thing did is it showed a bunch of people who would be very capable of doing this, but just didn't know. I just set up the compiler this way, and I can program to Windows directly, and oh wow, look at all this stuff I can do. I love it. And then they just go, right? They don't need to watch episode 600 of Handmade Hero, right? They just watch the first 20, and they're like, awesome. And then they're off on their own. And there's been tons of people who have done that and then gone off to start doing more like, I don't know what you want to call that kind of programming where you're not just using libraries all the time, but making your own new replacements for things. That was a huge part of it, a huge part of the benefit anyone else was getting from Handmade Hero, and I did not anticipate that. I can relate to that because one of the reasons, like, I'm not a very good assembly language programmer, for example, and the main reason for that is I never had any learning resources when I was a child. I literally didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what assembly language was, I didn't, or they didn't know what the instructions were, I didn't. But literally, I wouldn't have even known how to put assembly language into a Commodore 64. Like, I just fundamentally don't know. Because if I had had a resource that got me started, I bet I would be a much better assembly language programmer today. Because I would have started early, I would have done it the whole time, I would have had that background. And so to me, it's like, this is just another example of that. It's people who would have liked to do these things, who can do these things, they just didn't have the exposure.
Right. So exposing the idea that you can actually engage in these practices is one of the main core reasons to even, well, like you said, it's post hoc. It's not something you initially went into.
It's post hoc. Right?
Yes. But the idea of it being there as a resource now, especially those first 20 episodes, which I can tell you from personal experience have been pretty influential. I think they definitely show you that, like, hey, there's things you could do that you didn't know you could do, that once you're shown the initial couple steps, or it's like, there's a million different, well, it's even different than that, I guess. Because I was going to give you the classic example of, like, there's a cave and there's 3 entrances to it and you have to pick the right one. But it's more like there's a cave and you're trying to get in the cave, but you don't know how. And, like, it seems like everything's collapsed. And then you're like, hey, look, there's a video that shows you exactly where the secret entrance is. And that's how you get on your path, right? So, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, in that case, let's talk a little bit more about Star Code Galaxy, because I'm curious about this. You said earlier that you sort of accidentally became an educator in the field of programming. Is Star Code Galaxy, like, I think you kind of answered this before, but we'll give you an opportunity to explain a bit more about it. Is this you saying, okay, it's time to put my educator hat on officially, and here's the real official education for programming, and my name's on it, and here's what you're going to learn, and like you said earlier, this is born of, in some respects, the fact that you got so many requests for all of these individual particulars coming into it. What was the impact of Handmade Hero, broadly speaking, on what you're doing at Starcode Galaxy? Like, did it prepare you for like making sure you understood all of the questions that people might ask, or was there something else, or do you view them almost as like two completely separate things that almost accidentally connect to each other?
So, I mean, it's the impetus for it, meaning it's like if I hadn't done Handmade Hero, I wouldn't have been in this position where you're always inundated with questions or people asking how to do things, or hearing from people that, like I said, say, thanks for doing this series because it got me into blah, and now I do game engine programming for a living, or now I go do this for a living, right? And so I'm like, okay, there's a need for this thing. And because Handmade Hero was not conceived as an educational resource, it's not a good educational resource, right? People are making the best of it because it's what's available. But it's not designed to be a thing that does what it's doing. It just happens to be doing what it's doing because it's what's available. It's what people can find, right? So Starcode Galaxy is me saying, how can I make something that is intended to do this? So to make it more streamlined, to make it into a thing that's about lessons, that's about putting challenges in the right way, that's about helping people learn who need more than Handmade Hero. Because remember, Handmade Hero starts pretty high. We don't start with, what is a statement really on Handmade Hero, right? Like we don't really teach you programming. We assume you know a little bit of programming when you get there. So Starcode Galaxy is designed for basically like a broad range of people, so they can come at it from all different experience levels, and it will sort of push you through the right paths to get you into a fundamentals mindset. Whereas Handmade Hero is just like, look, you're mining the gold out of it if there's gold in there. Like I didn't do the work, right? Like because I wasn't trying to. So it's like, maybe it's coal and you're trying to squeeze it into a diamond, right? I didn't do that for you, right? So that's sort of more where Starcode Galaxy is coming from, and it's a pretty big undertaking, and so it's a lot of work, but I'm hoping it's worth it at the end of the day, because we'll find out, I guess.
Is there a specific approach you have to like any sort of project, which I imagine Starcode Galaxy would certainly qualify as, even though it's not a programming project in the conventional sense where you're writing software for the intent for an end user to use? Is there a specific approach?
It is.
Okay.
It's all custom software.
Oh, okay, perfect. Well, that's interesting. So my question then is like, do you have a specific approach to these these projects that have longer development cycles, or is this something that you're maybe just accustomed to by now? Because there's this perhaps more newfangled approach where people think that software shouldn't actually take too long to write, even really complex software like game engines, for example. And you know what? I'll even say that we're a bit guilty of this, because after 3 months, we've had most of what we needed for an initial start, and now we can sort of see where the finish line appears to be, and maybe we'll be proven wrong. But in this case, maybe that's just a specific outlier of like our game engine might not be as feature rich, or might not require the same kinds of things as some of the other engines out there might, as what you're supporting, for example. Like ours is primarily 2D, and to the degree we're using 3D is going to be pretty limited, so we probably don't need to worry as much about stuff like that, whereas maybe that's a huge time sink for somebody who's trying to program a 3D engine as a comparison. But like, do you think that there's like a specific mindset you have to get into as a programmer who's going to be undertaking large projects? So this is more of a meta question of how you approach these kinds of things.
Gosh. So as I've said many times before, like I'm really a tech person. I'm not a game person. And so I don't know how people build games. I try to point people towards like people like John Blow who managed to do incredibly deep, very ambitious game projects and actually ship them. I don't know how he does it. But if you were going to take advice from somebody about things like that, it would be him and not me. I don't know. What I like to do is I just like to program new things. That's what I like to do. I'm an R&D programmer at heart. So as long as I'm working on something research and development oriented, I'm happy. And it's why I try not to give advice to people about how A, to do long projects, or B, whether their projects should be long. It's like, that's product management. I don't do that. And people say, should I use Unity or should I use Unreal? Should I build my own? I'm like, I don't know. What I can tell you is that we need a lot more technological research and development. So that if you are the kind of person who has it in you to do tech R&D, it would be great if you did. If you found a place where you were happy doing that and could do it. But fundamentally, research and development and product development are at odds. Research and development is about following leads and investigating new possibilities. That is not what you want on a schedule for shipping things in reliable amounts of time. They're different activities. There's a reason the R&D department is different than the research department is different from the productization or the part where we just make whatever the consumer version is of this thing. So for me, I really have nothing to add to that discussion because to me, it's just like when the money runs out, I guess I'm done. I guess I'm just out of. I'm on the street begging for change, right? But you will literally have to I have to stop being able to pay for food before I would stop trying to find new ways to do things on a computer. So to me, I just want to work on stuff and find stuff out. And while we have funding, I'll be doing that. And I hope I can productize enough things to keep us out of debt or whatever. But I really don't have the urge to be like a Silicon Valley, we're shipping Instagram and we're going to get bought by it for $2 billion. I was like, I can't even relate to it because to me, I don't care. I want to see technology that's good and I want to find something new, a new way to do things. That's what I'm in it for. And I'll do it all day. I don't have to lie to myself about it. If it takes 10 years, I'm okay. If the money doesn't run out.
Right, as long as that happens. Okay.
You can stick me in a university somewhere is basically what I'm saying.
Right.
And I'd be totally fine with that, right?
So another thing that comes up a lot in the conversations you have with other people and as well as just in some of the Handmade Hero streams where you talk about the importance of speed. You've given a number of sort of lectures or conversations about this where if the program isn't running, if the program is the bottleneck itself, then that's going to cost a lot in the long run in terms of efficiency. And as a result, for a lot of companies, that's going to cost them budget because they have to pay these people to be in and working. So, the cheeky sort of example of this would be the punch card strategy from way back. And how if you made a mistake, then that was a day lost. And but we're not that far away from that at the same time. There's some programs that are just behemoths where if you press the compile button, you'll be waiting for a couple hours. So my question to you then is so this is more of a fundamental principle thing. Do you, when you're thinking about respecting the hardware of the end user and thus respecting the time of the end user, are these post hoc things that people attach to what you think about, how you think about programming or how you think about software development? Is this stuff that's just downstream of it as a natural second order consequence? Or is that one of the main motivating factors for you to make something as good as it can be? Because you said earlier, you're interested in making good software and finding new ways to do things with computer devices, right? So when basically what the question is why do you make such an attempt to, at the end of the day, the end of your attempts, the result is a program that respects the end user? Is that a main contributing factor, or is that just again a second order consequence of your programming style?
Well, it's an interesting question. I guess what I would say is there's certainly a degree of motivation that comes from being aggravated. If you're a person who is naturally aggravated by being forced to wait for something to happen that that does not require that, right? So, if you're waiting, if you're waiting 10, 20 seconds for a operating system to start up in 1996, I was like, okay, maybe that's correct. I don't really know. Nowadays, we're still waiting 20 seconds, and I can pretty much tell you, no, it's not, right? It's you can tell over time as things have changed, you're like, we're not we're not getting better here. Similarly, like, if you're on a internet connection with a 800 millisecond ping time to something versus you're on an internet connection with a 1 millisecond ping time to something, there's different fundamental bounds there that you might expect, et cetera, all that. So I would say I definitely am the kind of person who gets annoyed when something should be responsive or should be fast and isn't. And that does drive a certain aspect of your development methodology, because you're going to get annoyed with yourself if you make something that isn't doing that. And so that's just inherent. But I would say that, like, no, I guess I'm not really thinking about that per se. It's usually more just that fundamental knowledge that the computer is X fast and what I made is not X fast is more of a suggestion to me that the methodology was wrong. A lot of times nowadays what people will do is they'll make a trade-off. The trade-off will be to save themselves time at the expense of the end user. Programming something in Swift. I don't know. Like, they'll make a choice that's designed to save them time and make them comfortable. And they don't care that what that's doing is pushing the burden onto the end user, who will be, like, unhappy about it, right? Using a JavaScript framework that's massive. And so every time someone comes to the web page, it's downloading this huge thing and it updates all the time, so they can't even cache it, blah, 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 right? And I find that is a fundamentally unsatisfying kind of choice to make for me in engineering, because it means I am not doing real engineering, to me. Like, it's like, to me, there's a fundamental, like, I'm not doing my job if what I did was chose to save myself time instead of saving the end user time. Now, that's not the same as saying that there isn't a real cost to it, because at the end of the day, if I never finish the software I'm writing because I choose to, like, hand optimize everything in assembly for this, thing or whatever, and I have to do that every time the chip changes and all these other things, and who knows how absurd an example we could make. And so the end user never gets to even run the software. Well, that didn't really solve any problems either. But to me, that's not an answer. All that is just telling those of us who care about research and development that we haven't gotten where we need to get. Why can't we make it convenient for engineers to make software that actually does run well? Like what's the problem? Because it's not obvious to me that it's unsolvable. So the fact that we see this forced, what I would consider false choice of make a good piece of software or make a piece of software that you can write quickly, I don't want to see that choice be the choice forever. I want to see those come together where we can finally say the fast program is also the easy program. For someone who understands, for someone maybe you still have to have 20 years of experience, maybe you still have to be a very good programmer, but you can still make that choice. And I think we are getting closer. I am closer now than I was to that. But and I think as we see new languages over the next 10, 20 years, I think we will get closer. So I don't think it's a hopeless cause either.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways we could go from here. One of the things you described earlier is that the education for programming, you described it as anemic. And I think it's almost like education by way of immersing yourself within the field that you're trying to learn, be it programming or even like game design or anything, it could be a language. They tell you to immerse yourself in the culture and try to like pick up as much as you can just by maybe watching some movies or whatever. I feel like the same could be said for something like programming or a field of study as opposed to just maybe a culture of a specific place. However, this is something I find in a lot of like game design discussions as well, is the basic conversational sort of framework that you're running in your head when you're thinking about this, it is almost like lacking before you even start if the only thing you've experienced to inform your baseline opinions is already past the Overton window for somebody who comes at it from a different angle, right? And it's almost like you're trying to cross two barriers. You're mixing two worlds. So broadly speaking, the way I would bring this back to programming as well is like, if you are somebody who, I came up with the idea of the person who doesn't care whether or not programs are good or software is good, because it's not, how could it possibly, impact our lives negatively? And then obviously we gave a couple of examples. That kind of person does exist. And maybe that's a bit of a straw man in terms of like how, maybe that's like taken to an extreme, but the average person who just has a laissez-faire attitude and isn't really that convinced of like the importance of it, especially the average programmer who might not be convinced of the importance of respecting the hardware and also respecting the end user's time and all these other things, their baseline, like what they've been informed by, right? Their baseline education, their cultural backing is like far away from somebody like you and somebody like even myself, who I'm not like the most notable programmer by any means, but I'm still somebody who like has understood enough and done the research. And I didn't grow up around it, but I was able to go back and look at it. Is there like, I know you said earlier, you're not that interested in proselytizing it to everybody who might listen, but is there like if you had to recommend somebody who is at least open to the idea but didn't know where to start, is there like a resource somewhere, or is there some sort of mindset they can get into? Is there anything that maybe influenced you in the early stages? There's a story of you leaving C++ behind because you joined a programming team at, I think it was RAD, and you saw that all of these other experienced programmers were using C and not using all the libraries and not using all these other things, and then you decided to audit it. Is that like this, the mindset of auditing everything you're doing, is that what you would recommend? Like, help us out here if there's somebody out there is like listening to this and they're like, wow, I really agree with this guy's points, but I just don't know where to start. Sort of like the Handmade Hero example. Like, is there something that you could give as a resource to somebody like that, or advice you could give?
Well, so I guess I would say that it's challenging because in some ways it's difficult to... You hear a lot of people these days use a term that we never had when I was growing up. They say imposter syndrome. This is something that people talk about a lot, which I was unfamiliar with because that was never a term. But I understand what people are saying when they use that term now. But I guess what the way I would conceptualize it is somebody who's coming up through the programming education process, wherever that they're getting it from or however they're doing that, is going to naturally not have an intuitive trust of their own assessment of things. And you can call that imposter syndrome if you want, but I don't, it kind of sounds negative to me. I've never liked that term because everybody who's a novice is a novice. I mean, you're a novice. I knew I was a novice when I was a novice, and I didn't think of myself as an imposter, but I mean, you know that you don't know all the things that, people who are great programmers already know how to do. So I think it's difficult because a lot of what that moving away from object-oriented programming and things like that I think are very natural for people to actually do when they start thinking about programming fundamentals more deeply. You don't know, like you're just hearing all of these things from people, and different people are telling you things are true that are kind of in conflict if you think about them deeply. But if you don't even think about them deeply, you maybe are even accepting all of them as true or who knows what, right? And I do think it would be very challenging for such a person to come up through an educational process and actually be able to make sense of these things in any real way, resource or not, because how do you know that the resource that you're looking at is right? I mean, you yourself are not confident enough in your decision-making to say, oh, well, Casey's right about this, or Bjorn Strustup's right about this, or right? Like, you're not confident enough to make that call, or we wouldn't even be asking this question, right? So the only thing I can say in what I said before is ask for some demonstration of the thing being claimed, right? Ask for what it is supposed to accomplish and a demonstration of it accomplishing that thing. This is why I also try to talk about actual things we can measure. Lines of code necessary to solve the problem. Milliseconds it takes to run to solve the problem. How long does the compile take? How many dependencies are required? How often does it break? How many bugs were there? Things you can look at. And one of the things that I think is easy to say is that if you pick any program that exists currently in the wild that uses modern programming practices, it will fail on almost all of those metrics for almost any of the techniques they recommend. You can take the program with the technique, and then you can remove that technique, and usually one or all of those metrics get better. It's either less lines of code, it's easier to understand, it's less buggy, it runs more quickly, the executable's smaller, like the compile time drops. So what I would say is get back to having something you can actually measure. Don't take my word for something, and by my, I mean me or any other expert on something, because who knows? We might be totally wrong, and oftentimes we are. So right away, I don't think you can do that. But as you get more comfortable with programming and more comfortable understanding computers, try to give yourself some opportunity to look at real metrics and to test. Try some things and see. Does this actually improve or doesn't it? Because then you can actually start to make some real insights of your own. They may not be the same insights as mine, and that's a good thing. You should be making your own insights and driving your own path forward. Because like I said, I think we're at an early stage of understanding really how to program computers. And I don't think there should be a demagoguery of this is the one way to program, where it's too early. We haven't gotten there yet. So that's my opinion on that. I apologize, it's a hard answer. It's a hard answer, but I think that's the truth.
I totally agree, and I get that. Like, basically the idea of giving somebody actionable advice can always be tricky, especially when you are still in the early stages of programming. And that's like a brief question to you.
Yes.
Is like there are some people out there who think, maybe this is a normal thought process to have, right? And they think that like wherever they are is close to the end of the curve or whatever.
Right. But it's probably not.
Yeah. And so the question there is like, where do you think... Okay, this is an interesting topic that I think you'll have some opinions on, right? So there's obviously one thing that happens in the modern environment is fads, is what I would call them, or how I would describe them.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
very... Like, I'm now to the point where I'm very overly cautious when I see anything that purports to be like the new next way, the next best way to go about your programming business, and here's the thing to do.
Oh, yeah.
I'm super like, oh man, what are they selling and how bad is it? And like, I'm waiting for somebody who knows a bit more about it, who has like maybe beta tested it or something, to come back and tell me like, yeah, it's horrible in these ways. And now I'm like, okay, well, I almost have a little bit of confirmation bias at play there, where I'm like, I'm just by default expecting, anything that's modern and anything that purports to be something super game-changing to just be terrible at the end of the day. And one of these things that keeps coming up regarding programming is artificial intelligence, and not just programming artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence that will do the programming for you. And this has been a subject of recent, perhaps, debate in the community, more broadly speaking. The people who are interested in programming, a lot of people think like, oh, this is going to be great. I'll just type what I want and AI will do it. That's a very basic take on it. But like the broader question with that example is, how can we set aside, maybe this is a similar answer to what you just gave. How do we know when somebody is actually moving forward in a positive direction versus when they're just essentially selling like another product that's just yet another framework? And maybe a more personal level, where do you see the future of programming being? I know you could probably only answer this in the short-term sense because there's a lot we still don't know, but like, are there anything that's like super exciting about on a hardware basis or a software basis that will unlock additional programming capabilities, different ways that we can do it? Do you have like an idea of where the future of programming is going to be? And what do you have to say more broadly on like fads in programming and how to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were?
So with respect to fads in programming, I would say that you really don't have to worry about fads in programming because, again, it's the same answer to the previous question. If you can measure some obvious improvement that this thing is making, then it's worth doing. And if you can't, you don't need to worry about it. And you can choose to put the onus on the people selling the fad to show you that. Or you can just, if you're some people are tinkerers. I'm not myself. Some people are tinkerers. In fact, I've known some great tinkerers, I guess is what I'd say. They're an asset to any company. Any company should have at least one great tinkerer. And this is a person who just likes to go check out the latest thing, kick the tires a little bit, but is very level-headed and like knows what's going on, right? Some people are like that, and they, they'll go and picture and be like, yeah, it was good about this, it wasn't so good about this, right? I don't know what your personality type necessarily is, but depending on where you slot, you can interact with fads in various ways. Me, I completely ignore them, and then I just trust that, like, look, if this is really good, it'll be here 5 years from now, because if it was really, it should stick, right? So I usually just familiarize myself with roughly what's being said. Usually I'm like, okay, none of that's interesting. But if there's a kernel to it, I'm like, okay, maybe I'll check back a little bit. We'll let them work the kinks out, and we'll, mainline it if it turns out to be good or whatever. But overall, I would say the only thing that you really need to think about with fads is they're not the emergency everyone says they are. You'd never really have to like be worried about, am I missing the latest trend, and did I put a private operator equals in all of my classes? Oh my God, my code is horrible. Like, that's all garbage. Anyone who tells you need to be on the latest trend is totally lying. But not all fads are completely pointless. So it does behoove you just keep a little bit aware of them and see if you can get it. And if you happen to know a tinkerer, use them as a resource. They'll go play around with Rust and tell you if the borrow checker really is something you should be interested in or not, right? And it saves you the trouble of having to do it, which is great if you have someone you trust, because, if you're not a tinkerer, you don't want to have to install new languages or new IDEs or whatever the latest fad is. With respect to, so try and take your questions in order. So artificial intelligence programming, I would say, is great, because a lot of the programs that I interact with on a daily basis, like anything made by Google, feels like it was written by an AI that just kind of mushed some things together, and it doesn't really work. And there's bugs that have been there for years that are just never going to get fixed because they were a hole in the AI that, it couldn't ever find something on Stack Overflow that did this thing correctly. So it's just always going to use the incorrect one or whatever. So honestly, I don't care. Like, if the top tranche of just programmers who smush things together is replaced by an AI, that would be fine with me. I don't see there being any real downside to that. And I don't see software quality going downhill relative to the current state because of that. Because it just seems like an AI which doesn't really understand what it's doing is similar to a programmer which doesn't really understand what they're doing. And so I don't see AIs anytime soon replacing the people making really core component things that have to be like hardcore and stuff like that. Maybe they will eventually, but not right away. And for the tranche that AI can replace, I don't think there'll be much of a change. Other than maybe it's bad for the workforce because less people are getting paid. So maybe there's a wealth concentration issue that happens there. Because then what do those programmers do? Right. I mean, they can't move down the stack because they don't have the skills to do so. So I don't know if that causes a problem. Who knows? Finally, as far as the future of programming, like you said, I still do think it's early days. The main thing I could tell you is I don't think we're going to be using text editors in 50 years. The idea that you feed text through a compiler is antiquated. It's sad that we haven't moved past it. This will not be the way programs are made. So the biggest change I think we'll see, hopefully in my lifetime, before I'm pushing up the daisies, is we will finally move away from text files as how we represent code, because they're inherently one-dimensional and not very interesting. They're cumbersome to edit, and they also don't represent any of the concepts of programming. They're made for language, which is not what a CPU does. And so I think we'll see a move away from that. But it's a slow process. Programming has a lot of dependencies. I think we're going to get there, but it's a grind. And it's going to take a few really gnarly, burly sorts of programmers to like push past that into the next thing. But once we're in there, I think it'll, proliferate rapidly. It's going to take a push.
When we're talking about the end result of some of these programming disciplines and some of the consequences of adopting certain things. Obviously, one of the big focuses of them, at least as far as this channel is concerned, is video games. And there's a design discussion or two that are on there with your friend Jonathan Blow, who you referenced earlier, where in one of the design discussions, you had a quote, something along the lines of that your understanding of what an engine is capable of vastly dwarfs your understanding of what you actually want that engine to do. So my initial question for you is, I guess the first question should be like, how often do you actually play video games in general as a form of perhaps research or maybe more commonly leisure? Is that something you engage in very frequently?
I play games. I used to play a lot of games. I don't play games that much anymore. When I was younger, I played a ton of games. Commodore 64, Amiga, PC later, when it got into a more gaming situation, I played a ton of games. And my knowledge of gaming and what was in games at that time, I think, was pretty good. Not as a designer, but just awareness, right? If I was going to be a critic of games or something at that point, maybe my knowledge would have been sufficient. If I was going to try and be a critic of games today, I would be woefully underprepared. I'm not aware of what a lot of people are doing. I haven't played all the relevant games. I just fundamentally don't know what's going on. I play games occasionally on stream with John, or I'll play a few games that people said they were good, but I really don't play them that much. And one of the reasons that I say that it's not really my thing, as far as like game design is concerned, and anytime game designer stuff comes up, I always point people to John instead of trying to answer anything or say anything, is because one thing I've really appreciated over time is that from watching people who really know how to design games, it looks a lot like people who really know how to program. It's a very experiential, hands-on thing that they do. They do not fundamentally write a design document and hand it to somebody to program. They experience things and they change things and see firsthand themselves how that change made a difference. And what I think makes a truly great game designer is basically the same as what makes a truly great programmer, but for that slightly different act. A great programmer is someone who fundamentally enjoys and continues to do that permutation analysis process of small changes to how the program is written, how it is executed, et cetera, right? And a great game designer is someone who fundamentally enjoys, engages in, and has a good grasp of that same thing, but for the design of the game. The parameters that tune it, the logic that makes the decisions, the audio-visual responses that go along with it, and what they mean, and how they're interpreted, that whole thing. And it's why I don't think I should really do game design. It's because I don't fundamentally gel with that process. I can feel it when I do it, that I just don't enjoy it the way I enjoy the same act of pure programming, of trying to get a non-aesthetic result, right? Of trying to get a engineering result. And I think, I don't want to psychoanalyze John here, but when I watch him do design, I can see that he is having that experience with the design that I have with the engineering and that I don't have with the design. I think that's one of the reasons I have so much respect for him. I can see it. And it's really great. And there's not that many designers who have it, but to me, that's really the thing that, like, if I saw someone doing that, even if they weren't a great designer today, I'd be like, that person's going to be a great designer someday. Like, that's what it's all about, is that search and that relentless, like, trying to understand how all these changes matter and looking and see, oh, well, what if I did this with that creative thing? It's like, oh, no, it didn't. That was surprising to me. Why was it surprising, right? Like, all those same things you do with the engineering, you can do with design. And I see it in great designers when they do what they do, you know?
So my follow-up question to that then would be like, you're saying that you're game design isn't your massive like focus as a result of you tried it out and it doesn't gel with it. You don't gel with it the same way that you gel with programming. So the question then is, I know you're working on something that you've described before as like interactive fiction. I'm not sure how much you want to discuss this or how much you want to keep it under wraps, but if you're not somebody who thinks too much about game design, you might have some opinions on this. And in fact, I am cheating a little bit here because I know you have a couple opinions that you alluded to in a very obscure part of your channel that you had back and forth way back in 1999 with someone, and you said that you don't share any opinions that person does. So I know you've thought about this. I know you've thought about interactive fiction. So I have not been able to ever get a definitive answer on what you think specifically. Maybe I just missed the resource, but I'll give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about interactive fiction, what you find compelling about it, and what you want to maximize in your own project in 1935.
Sure. So interactive fiction is interesting to me for exactly what I just said. So eventually I kind of realized, or at least I feel like it's true, that I'm never going to be good. Not even I'm never going to be great. I'm never even going to be good, right? Like at best I could strive for, I think, would be mediocre. If I worked hard at it, at like designing an RPG, right? Like period. Like if I tried really hard, the degree to which it fights my natural inclination is I will never be good, I will never be great, and I will never probably even be good. The best I could hope for is mediocre. But I do like games, and I like working on game technology. I think it's interesting. So to me, what that says is I can't really work on games per se if the game is about being better at design than someone else making an RPG. At best, I'm going to make another relatively uninteresting RPG, right? Like that's what's going to happen if I do that. So if I'm going to do something game related, it has to be about bringing some new technology to the table and not about having to be better at design than people are currently designing things. The design has to be fairly straightforward coming out of the tech. And then if other people want to come along and take, okay, you made advances in technology, now we're going to make a better design that's, that gets the most out of those things. I think we have plenty of examples of that. I mean, like I think of id Software as a good example of doing this thing. id Software's contribution to games is not just the design of their FPSs. They sort of brought a whole technology to the table that then other people made completely different ideas about what that game would be like design-wise. And it went far beyond any of the things that they really ever tried to do necessarily, right? I mean, even to the point where people have taken that game and made things like, like Dear Esther or Firewatch that are like a first-person shooter that doesn't even shoot anymore. But it was critical that we pushed past that tech barrier to ever enable those designers to do what they were going to do. Because they were never going to do it. They didn't even, a lot of those people don't even know how first-person technology even works, right? So someone has to make those steps. So for me, that's why interactive fiction is interesting. There's one other interesting thing that we've got in the works. Well, two, actually. So we've got three things that we'd like to do eventually if we don't go out of business beforehand. Obviously, Starcode Galaxy is not one of them. That was just something that we're trying to do in the meantime. And all three of them are just tech in games. And interactive fiction is exactly that. It's trying to make a technology for interactive fiction that actually lets you interact with the fiction. That is something that really hasn't been done before. The reason it hasn't been done before is because you have to have the engine be able to deal with a very large number of interactions per second, relative to, other kinds of interactive fiction things you've seen, and integrate all of those choices to make it really feel like an interactive experience. And we have no idea how to do that right now, right? Like no one's put forward the engine that really shows that you can have a truly interactive experience that only focuses on the fiction. There's nothing else in there. They all feel like branching narratives with some very little like sugarcoating on top. So what I want out of the interactive is just to prove you can do the really feels interactive one of those things. Feels like a game, like I'm really playing it and I'm making choices and they're second to second mattering with fiction alone. That is where I want to get with it. And if I can manage to ship that, I think that's a good jumping off point then for anyone who wants to focus on the design. What can you do with that if you've proven it's possible, right? Like, what could you do to any other types of games? What could you do with this type of game? Does it grow into a new type of genre? I don't know, but like that's the goal technologically.
So what this makes me think of when you describe it that way, as far as interactive fiction goes, for a long time, I've thought we had a poverty of words describing different kinds of games, because there are games that are like What Remains of Edith Finch or whatever that people would pejoratively describe as walking simulators. And I've even been, when I was younger, I would even say similar kinds of, levy kinds of things that like, oh, that's so boring. Why would anybody want to play that if it's just a narrative and, I could just read it or something. Right. And to some degree I can see, I mean, I haven't played it specifically, that specific game, but I have played some games that would be described as that, and I can kind of see the complaint insofar as it doesn't really feel like there's a difference between me doing this and me watching somebody else do it on YouTube, because like my personal experience hasn't changed anything. And so what your description of interactive fiction makes me think about is like, if I take a really grand scope thing, like there's a fantasy novel, and in the novel you have one character who's like you're following around as a protagonist, and he like eventually raises an army and defeats the big bad. But if you just took that setting and then imagined that like without him being the pivotal latchkey thing that changes the course of history, the big bad would invade anyway. I'm kind of thinking about an interactive fiction environment in like, okay, maybe I am the protagonist that can save everybody, but I just chose to do something else instead, and now I'm like living on a farm, and then the big bad invades and it's over, or something like that. That's a kind of a silly example, but if we went down that road, does that match up with your description or what you think of in your head? Because I'm trying to make sure that I have the right sort of concrete understanding of what it is. Because like in my head, if somebody says interactive fiction the way that you just said it, that's kind of what I think. I think of like, here's a setting, here's a premise, and there are things that are going to happen if you do not change them. And then I guess some things probably would be impossible to change because they're outside of your character's purview. But like, if we focus just on the things that you can't interact with, you can like make all these different choices. And some choices are like, you can't make that choice if you made this other choice. Is that sort of what you're working with, or is it something else entirely and I've got it totally wrong?
I don't think there's any way to get things wrong when you're talking about something that is as widely interpretable as what do we want out of interactive fiction, or what is interactive. I mean, interactive fiction was a word used to describe non-interactive fiction, right? Like if you go back and look at the things that are currently described as interactive fiction, like Infocom games, they were non-interactive. The fiction is fixed. You can't interact with it at all. What you interact with is the objects in the world, and when you put those objects into a particular combination, the fiction moves forward in a pre-described way. It's not interactive fiction, but that's what that term was used for. So if I may try to illustrate this, because I've been thinking about interaction fiction for about 30 years at least, and it might even be longer than that. Maybe might be more like 35 at this point. A lot of people, for some reason, have a very difficult time making obvious analogies to things they already know. And I would describe that statement you just made as a classic example.
Okay.
Do you think... Name a first-person shooter you like.
Counter-Strike.
Is Counter-Strike less interactive because you have to decide to fight the people on the other team?
No, that's just a framework that you're using within which to make further decisions. Okay.
Yes. So if you could map that onto interactive fiction for a second, no, you can have a story where the story is always, I am going to go fight the bad guy at the end of this fantasy adventure. What matters is there an actual game to play? Like, is there something where the choices I'm making about what to do and the skill with which I do them properly add up to a challenge or not even a challenge, but an experience that I enjoyed, or preferably if it's a game, a challenge I can succeed or fail at doing? If so, you have created a valid work of interactive fiction for any definition that we could choose to apply, because if you didn't want to apply it, you'd have to then go claim that Counter-Strike is not interactive, right? So to me, I would say no. You don't have to be able to make large-scale decisions about what's going to happen in the story, because we've never demanded that of any other piece of video game. We all are very capable of understanding what the scope is of our role in an interactive work, and I've never seen that be a problem for anything else.
Okay, so in that case, right? So that kind of explains. I picked a large scale example for the story, like the fantasy novel, because partially because I just really like large scale conflicts, but also because I understand that that's like that's probably a very common, ubiquitous example of like a fantasy plot that people have figured out. So in your example, I mean, for 1935, is there something that you like? How have your first, I don't know how far along it is in development, but I'll ask a broad question of like, how have you been able to start putting these ideas to work as far as like the technical things, the problems that you have to solve on a technical basis and engineer in that respect? Like, have you already started on that process? Like, what are the opening results looking like for you? And are you confident in the direction you're going in?
Oh, very confident. The problem, like the interactive fiction part, is not so hard. The harder part has been more like art pipeline stuff and how do you present it in a way that's, I mean, I would say that the knock-on effects of interactive fiction are hard to wrap your head around for only one program, which is just me, and it's a bit difficult. So a lot of the problems are, okay, if you want this engine, suppose you have solved all the interactive fiction problems such that there is some output of your system. Well, you still have to present a game. Like that has to have AV, right, associated with it. And there's just a lot, there's a lot of easy ways, and I've made them all, like a lot of easy mistakes you can make about how to try and get that pipeline working that don't work very well. Because normally when we think about this sort of thing, we normally think about stuff where we are making like cutscenes, and we place the camera here and we put the characters there, and then we sync them up on a timeline. Well, if everything is being output from this thing, this magical box that we don't know what it's going to output exactly, because it's it has to be interactive. We can't constrain it to only do this one thing. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around how you actually put together that part of the system. Like, what do you actually do to make that work cleanly? And it's a struggle. I would probably be done by now if I didn't have so many other things to do. So I don't want to overstate it. But the reason it's not already done is because I didn't do a very good job with a lot of that stuff. And I've had to do it multiple times, which cost a lot in terms of delays. And, if I were to go back and do it again, I probably would have made something else first, like visual novel creator thing or something, without any of the other stuff, just to make sure I had a solid understanding of exactly how I want to do these art pipelines first, and then did the step to interactivity. So I was only dealing with the delta instead of the whole. Somebody's focusing on a problem is too big is harder, and you want to break it into halves, right? But I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic that I'll still have a chance I'll still have enough time to finish up and ship these things, because I always know what I'm going to do next. I just don't always have the time to do them, right? So,
well, okay. So one of the things that you brought up there is when you're talking about the cutscene problem and solving the pipeline problem so that you can make sure that you're showing the right result of all of this input so far and all of the interactions that have happened so far. It's an interesting problem to conceptualize, because if anybody, a really easy example is there's a cutscene in Halo 2, and in the cutscene, Master Chief is walking down after destroying an enemy tank, and he's got an assault rifle in his hand. And that cutscene is always the same weapon, even if you didn't have an assault rifle on you. And that's a very simple example of this discordance between what the player may have done, even super far back. They dropped their assault rifle an hour ago of playtime, and now here they are, but now they have it back. That's a classic example of that discordance and that not really working well with itself. And then you can think of the modern open world game, and you've made all of these different decisions. And so the way that they the brute force method of resolving that problem is making like 3,000 cutscenes and having each one of them play at different times, which I think has actually ballooned a lot of game budgets. And one of the reasons, an indirect reason, but one of the reasons why budgets are so out of whack for video games now. One of the reasons why it's so hard to make a game like an open world game if you also want to include cutscenes or any sort of if then else kind of thing, because like you said earlier, you have to package a game with it. It can't just be a text adventure in the same way as it maybe once upon a time that was more acceptable. So I would say
which would obviously have been much more easy. Like, if you imagine what it takes to ship, an Elder Scrolls title in text versus what it takes to ship an Elder Scrolls title the way they ship it, I mean, it's night and day. Right?
Yeah, it is night and day. I was going to say the same thing. So, yeah, in that case, I guess my question to you then is, are there types of games or like where they've done some sort of system that is even remotely comparable? Are there things that have been made that you're aware of on an engineering solution that you've emulated or that you've sought to maybe learn from? Or has a lot of this been more homegrown? How did you get around? How are you approaching the problem of solving the sort of pipeline problem? And then also on top of it, what were, if there are any, what were some influences for resolving that issue or inspirations that you may have taken from other games or other maybe non-games, completely unrelated to games?
I guess no. I guess I didn't really take much inspiration from anything else. I mean, it's really a devil's in the details kind of problem. I don't think it's a conceptual issue. It's just really, it's a data management issue, right? It's like, what are you going to make and how are you going to combine it at runtime? And subtle differences in how you do those things make a difference. In some ways, if you did it in 3D, which we're not, we're 2D. 3D is really too expensive, I think, for a small outfit like us. If you do it in 2D, it is in some ways harder. Because in 3D, like your assault rifle problem, well, it's pretty easy to swap out assault rifles in 3D, right, to a different gun. And maybe it looks a little janky because people wouldn't carry a shotgun the way they would carry an assault rifle, so it's a little bit of a lie, but it's not as obvious of a lie. This can be much harder in 2D because anytime you want something to be swapped out, all of the frame, every pose of the character that might involve that thing has to be redrawn. So, there's a lot of concerns, and 2D is in some ways harder than 3D, but, budget-wise, 3D is a big ask for art. So, you take your trade-offs, So I wouldn't say there was much inspiration. It's really just about trying to manage those things. And I think I eventually got to a good place, but it just took way too long. And there's a lot of other stuff in there that I'm leaving out. But one of the core problems of being an R&D programmer is you're kind of always trying to solve all the problems all the time. And so, everything was new for our technology stack as well. So, there's just that kind of overhead that's constantly on it as well. So sorry, I don't really have a good answer to the question, but
no, that's fine. I mean, in many respects, it kind of underscores the nature of the issue. And it's an interesting problem to think about too, just because the more I think about it, I haven't actually seen a solution that works. Like I said earlier, the brute force solution I encounter where people just make as many cutscenes as they can with the budget that they have is usually the only thing that I've seen where people actually try to solve this problem of, based on the player's inputs, we need to do X instead of Y. And except there's 30 alphabets worth of letters that you have to account for depending on how, diverse the game actually is or how many options you have.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a struggle. But it's all of these are solvable problems. It's just, it takes a long time, right? Like anything else, it takes a long time. Because it's not something that's it's not the common case that we do. So, we haven't worked out exactly how it works. And, my hope is 20 or 30 years from now, that would not be the case. And everyone would just know how all this stuff happens. But, like I said, some people have to kind of just go in there first and get slapped around a little bit. And that's fine. Those of us who don't mind, that's what we're here for, right? So that's the hope. Is that somebody, and maybe it's not us, but hopefully somebody is able to pull all those things together in a way that says look here, this can work. right? And no one's really been able to do that yet, but I'm hoping we will be able to. And if for some reason we can, I'm hoping someone else can, right?
So I know that this interactive fiction project, or projects multiple, as you alluded to, you have a couple of different things in this pipeline. I know this isn't the only writing that you've done, right? You've done writing for Meow the Infinite, as I'm aware.
Yes. Yes.
So this might be a bit of an out of left field question, but I was curious as to your interests within comics and comic books, and like maybe how that started. If there is I don't know if there's any interesting story that you can do.
Yeah.
So yeah, give us that, the origin of Casey Muratori and comics.
So there isn't much of an origin of Casey Muratori in comics. There's just an origin of Meow the Infinite. Now I have read some seminal comics. When I worked at Rad, the guy who founded Rad, Jeff Roberts, he is a comics fan, old school comics fan. You know, he has shelf of proper comics, individual issues, not the like collected ones, right? Of various comic series. So I don't really remember why, but at some point, maybe I read Mouse or something because it was kind of a more literary thing that people had talked about. Maybe I read it. I don't remember what the first thing I asked him. I was like, what should I read? Like, can you give me some comics to read? I don't know what I should read. And he gave me a bunch of them. He was like, oh yeah, you read, here's Watchmen, here's like Frank Miller's Dark Knight, here's a bunch of assorted Alan Moore stuff as well, not just Watchmen. And I think The Killing Joke was in there as well, and Long Halloween. I'm trying to think of I'm just trying to go back to my head. The Sandman series, all that stuff. And so, I read all of that. And I have some limited background in comics in that sense, but I was never a huge comics fan. I like the format. I find the writing sometimes to be a little too sort of truncated for my taste. It's a little bit hard for me necessarily in that sense. One of the reasons I always kind of like the Alan Moore comics is they're wordy, right? I mean, they are wordy comics. I don't know if that rubs some people the wrong way, but I always liked them. So it's not really that I have no experience with comics, but I wouldn't consider myself a comics fan. What happened with Meow the Infinite was that we did 1935, and there's a lot of programming to do, but the artists are done. I made out all the stuff, and I know how to do art direction. Probably better than I know how to do programming management, right? Because programming management, I don't know how you manage R&D. You just can't really, right? But art direction I can do. So, I had it planned out as like, here's all the stuff we need to do. There were 2 artists, 1 contractor worked on it as well for a little time. So at one time there was 3 artists, but it was mostly just 2. And when the art was finished, Anna is a permanent employee at Molly Rocket. And so we were like, what should we do? Like, we should continue to make artwork, but I don't think it makes a lot of sense to just keep making artwork for this game. We don't need any more. It's not supposed to have that much more art in it. And so we decided, well, we could do a comic book. She'd always wanted to do one. She loves comic books, and she loves animated things as well, like, Disney animation, that sort of thing. So, but the main reason she never done one is she really only works well from a script. She's not the kind of person who will just start drawing a comic of her own accord. She wants to have, she's like the epitome of a production artist. Like, she wants to be in production. She wants to say, this is what we're doing. Here is the script. Let's figure out what that looks like. And she actually loves doing layouts and cinematography and stuff like that. So she likes creative control, but she wants it after a certain point, right? She wants it after it's been decided what we're doing, right? And so really what I did on that project was I filled in as the writer to create, a script for the comic, and she did the direction. So she would look at the drafts and be like, oh, we need more of this. Let's do less of that. I don't like this. We need more, I don't feel like I understand this part as well, or whatever. So she did the direction and basically runs the project. And I just serve as basically like a contract writer, if you will. And she puts it out. And I love it. I got to say, I was surprised I actually love it. I didn't know how it was going to come out, but it's a really heartfelt story, and Anna has done some just fantastic artwork for it. As you get up through book 2, and you kind of start to find out what's going on in things, and you see how it goes. Like it's really it's a very heartfelt story, and I like it a lot more than I thought I was gonna for a comic. So I'm really happy to have been involved with it. I'm glad I had the opportunity to do it, and I'm excited to see what people think once all 3 books are ready. It's a very intricate story that everything relates to everything else, so it kind of has to be taken as a whole. And unfortunately, with anything serial like that, the drawings take a long time. So until it's all done, I won't really know what people think of it, but hopefully they'll like it. We'll see.
So it sounds like there was nothing but good things to say about the whole process overall and how you felt about it at the end of it. Of course, still some to be announced or to be determined. But does that mean that there's like room for more of this kind of sort of like you writing comics or you being involved in that process? Do you think that that's another sort of future element of your career that you might end up going down as far as like its involvement with Molly Rocket? Or is that more of like a one and done thing? Like how do you approach that kind of idea?
We have one that we'd like to do after Meow the Infinite because we enjoyed doing it so much. And Anna loves it. It's her favorite thing to do is draw comics, really. So, we probably would do another one. And the Kickstarters have been very successful. We haven't paid a dime to print those, books because the Kickstarters have all been backed and then some. So, people have been very supportive of the project. I don't know what they think of it, but they at least are supportive of it. Which has been awesome. So there is more stuff coming. I'll say 2 things about that. One is I do think it's important to do the writing process because fundamentally speaking, if you want to make advances in interactive fiction, you don't have to go win a Pulitzer Prize, but you kind of need to have that experience, right? You need to put yourself in the shoes of people who are going to have to write these things for real. If interactive fiction ever became a big thing, you have to be a writer, know what that is, go through the process of doing actual writing and figuring out what's hard about it and putting it out and taking criticism and changing things. I feel like that's important because, like I said, you don't have to win a Pulitzer Prize, but you should have done it. Right? I don't think you can fundamentally make this new technology if you don't understand the writing process from the perspective of the writer. So, I don't know that I have to become a great writer, but I think I do have to be a writer if I want this technology to work. Because one of the things that you'll note is a lot of the people who, there's never been somebody who's written a popular thing that then worked on interactive fiction technology. That never occurred, right? And who knows how much of that insight is necessary to make sure that this thing really does work, to produce stories people want to play. It can't just produce a story. It has to produce a good enough story that you want to play it. And without having gone through the writing process and having some feedback and seeing what works and what doesn't, how are you going to make that tech, right? So I do think that, there's more in the future for us. Again, as long as we stay in business, we probably will still have a comic, at least in the pipeline to some degree. And the other thing I would say about that is actually because as part of Starcode Galaxy, we're releasing our own web platform because that's what Starcode Galaxy lives on. It has its own payment processing and its own web presence that you can actually play through a web browser. We will actually be shipping our own comic system on there as well. So there will be a way to read Meow the Infinite directly in the browser with a cool comic experience that we think we're doing some interesting things with. And that's going to be a new thing, too, that will be coming in relatively short order. That's one of the first things we'll be shipping, actually, on the system. So we also hope to bring some interesting things out there because one of the things that I think is really true is if you look at the state of comics right now, the software for comics sucks. It is not a satisfying experience to read comics on Amazon or Comixology or the Marvel app or whatever. These are not great programs that people have spent a lot of time making awesome. They're just fundamentally a glorified PDF viewer. And so I think we can do some interesting things there, and we'll have more to say about that in a few months.
That's really exciting to me. Anytime somebody who has enough of a body of work that I can like look at and obviously see, oh, this person is legit, they know what they're doing to some degree, like who says that they're also going to tackle a problem like web platforming, which to me is like, I mean, we have actually part of our engine generates like extended markdown or extended HTML files for our website. So we all know firsthand on our side of things, like how annoying it is to write anything to do with web and web development in general. We still run into stuff like, like a user will report a visual bug, like some minor annoyance. And they're like, yeah, this scroll bar is really annoying. Can you make it like less bright because it clashes with everything else on the website? And like, oh, it's not like that on my browser. That's crazy. Nobody would ever guess that it was different. So I don't know to what degree your web development solution is attempting to like resolve problems of consistency between browsers or what, but it sounds like it's something that will be, maybe you can clue me in on the specifics. It sounds like it's something that will be really useful for your own set of solutions to problems that a lot of people face when they're dealing with any sort of interactions with browsers. Could you speak a little bit on that?
Yes, I can. So I wouldn't want to oversell that aspect of it, because fundamentally speaking, if somebody is going to interact with this thing via a web browser, there are certain limitations that kind of will always come with that. So I don't think there's the scroll bar issue that you referenced, maybe you can mitigate that to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, if somebody ships a browser update that screws up something, then it screws up something, and you maybe have isolated yourself from it a little bit, but there's not a lot you can really do. Browsers are not a great platform. They weren't really designed, in a sensible way by the people who actually functionally implement browsers might be pretty good, but the people who design the architecture of what they're running were not, right? And so they're fundamentally saddled with this really lousy problem, kind of self-perpetuating problem. And so, I don't want to oversell it. I don't know that we're going to be able to make significant inroads into maybe some of the things that you're concerned about there. But we are trying to do some interesting things there. We are trying to make it so that there's a more unified experience depending on how you access the things that we ship. And we are interested in doing some things that maybe other people have not tried to do. So we will see, we'll see in practice what people experience, but we are hoping that when you use things like our comic experience on web, you will feel a very dramatic difference in terms of responsiveness and performance compared to what you're used to, even on a web browser. Again, that performance may vary because if you're in a very tenuous connection and it's the first time you've ever interacted with it, so it can only do limited caching or whatever, or you're using Safari, heaven help you, and it decides to just throw out everything it's cached, whether it doesn't want to ask you about that or whatever. There's real limitations you can't necessarily get around, but I do hope that we will demonstrate that things don't have to be slow and laggy and take forever, and they can be a little bit more responsive and unified. So we will be hopefully doing some of that.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, anything that improves consistency for like an end user experience is definitely, or like you said, like sort of levels up the idea. You were drawing comparisons to other comic experience apps, like the Marvel one, for example. Stuff like that, people who are fans of this will definitely know the current maladies plaguing them as users of those programs, and I'm sure they'll get excited about the idea that maybe something better is soon to come. So that's pretty cool. We'll pivot over to some sort of grab bag questions that don't necessarily fit into a broader streamlined theme. And then we'll probably close the interview out pretty soon, I think. So the first thing I wanted to ask about in this vein is cryptocurrency, because I know you've been doing a number of interviews. And one of the things that you said at the beginning of the first interview was that you are building your sort of consensus, your personal thought process about cryptocurrency and, some of the technology that the blockchain offers. And this is a topic that a lot of people have very impassioned sort of perspectives on, and a lot of people will say a lot of things. So I'm personally agnostic on the subject because I haven't researched it enough myself to know what the good, bad, and ugly is of the whole technology. I'm vaguely aware of some concerns about moving Ethereum environmentally and stuff like that, but that's basically where my knowledge sort of ends. So, not necessarily asking you to explain it like I'm five or to a layman, but I'm just curious about your thoughts so far. If we can get like a teaser for people who are awaiting your sort of final conclusions at the end of the interviewing process, or towards the end, if there even is going to be an end in that subject. So what are your thoughts about blockchain, cryptocurrency, based on the interviews you've had so far? And maybe you could even make a recommendation for like if there's one specific interview that you thought was really interesting that people could check out.
I don't know that there's one specific interview you can check out because, again, it's pretty broad and the subject matter ties into a lot of things. The main thing I would try to get across is that cryptocurrency and blockchain are two different things. And I think cryptocurrency is obviously good. I think even before going into any of the interviews, my assumption was that it was obviously a useful financial tool. And what I mean by that is being able to generate a public and a private key, for example. This very fundamental cryptographic concept is obviously useful for things like being able to create one-time payments to people or to create open receptacles for money that can take money in, but that you couldn't take any money out of, ways of verifying that I actually said that I wanted to do a transaction, so long as my key isn't compromised. These are obvious tools that banks have not deployed very broadly in the United States and should. So I might say that cryptography and transactions go together well, and I would highly recommend that everyone familiarize themselves with the potential of that because I don't think there's a lot of debate about that. I certainly can't see any reason why you wouldn't want some of the basic things that you can do with cryptography like that are implemented in some actual cryptocurrencies today to just be things that are endemic to the banking system going forward. Why do I have a single credit card number that can be stolen, right? It doesn't make any sense because I should be able to just generate a unique key pair for every transaction so that the only transaction that key pair can do is that transaction, right? That is an obvious thing that we want and that we should have. So I think that cryptocurrency is definitely good. The thing that I don't understand the point of and that I have yet to hear anyone really convince me of is blockchain. Blockchain doesn't make any sense to me because blockchain to me still seems like a poor solution to a problem because it provides only security guarantees we don't need. That is my problem with it. So it expends a tremendous amount of resources to be a distributed consensus protocol that at the end of the day, every hypothetical I've ever been able to pose to people always comes back to something in the real world like, oh, well, the person wouldn't do that. Or this would just go to the court system. Or I'm like, well, then we don't need it, right? So I'm having trouble getting any really enthusiastic cryptocurrency advocate to satisfy my level of scrutiny as to what blockchain actually does in practice that doesn't just fall back to some social convention we could have just agreed on and then use something less costly than blockchain that doesn't provide the security at that level. It's a question about where that security occurs. And that, to me, is the really open question about blockchain. And one of the reasons I'm very skeptical about things like Ethereum and Bitcoin and so on is because they seem to be spending a tremendous amount of engineering resources and electrical resources and so on, computing hardware, to solve a problem that I don't think it solves. Because it still ends up kicking the can down to some secondary system when you really push on a hypothetical. So to me, that's where my concern lies. I'm worried that we're about to spend hundreds of billions of dollars total building a new financial backbone that actually sucks because it's spending a tremendous amount of resources solving a problem we don't actually have because we need all these other guarantees in the social realm anyway that make it duplicitous. That's the problem that I'm worried about. And have I heard a solid, convincing answer to that yet? No, I haven't. But I've got more interviews to do, and I will be doing them over the next couple of months. So I don't want to say that I've got all the answers because I don't. I'm just saying what my concern is. So cryptocurrency, yes. Blockchain, no, is where I'm currently at. But we'll see. And by the way, none of that has to do with whether I think it'll be adopted. So there's a question of, will blockchain be adopted? Even if it sucks as much as I think it does, it might still be adopted. So that doesn't mean, tons of things I think suck are adopted. Welcome to the web, right? I mean, so what becomes the underlying technology? It might just happen. So you also have to keep in mind that this is a technological inquiry, not a political inquiry. I cannot tell you what's going to be adopted, and I'm not trying. So.
Another interesting topic of conversation, I think, is the subject of credentials. So, or credentialing in the first place. This is something that this is something you tweeted about a long time ago, and I did say we would be talking about Twitter at some point. So here's part of where it comes back into play. One of the things that you mentioned is that credentialing. Calling somebody an expert or whatever their title might have been, it's like basically operating within a fundamentally broken system. I was interested in your thoughts on that. If you could exposit that in this kind of format instead, where there's a little bit more time to go back and forth. But at first, I'll tell you personal experience that I think a lot of people who are trying to get into tech gigs or tech jobs or tech careers have experienced. And I've personally experienced this looking for jobs as a game designer or a story writer in a video game or anything like that. And it's basically comes down to, we don't necessarily want to pay you that competitive of a salary, but maybe we can budge on that. We do, however, need you to be responsible for 3 shipped titles in the past 5 years, and you should have at least X number of years of industry experience, and you should be familiar with all these things that we might not even use, but would show that you know what you're talking about. And I have no industry experience. I'm completely outside of that realm. I didn't go to school for programming or game design or anything like that. I don't have a degree in writing. However, and this is probably a deeply biased thing. However, I still find my own work, to be a lot more compelling than what I experience. And one of the main motivational factors for me to do any work in this sector is because I'm not satisfied with what's already out there. And so I would feel like, even though obviously there's the idea that you might be biased towards your own work and you're trying to big yourself up, if I'm ruthlessly critical of myself as I am, and I still end up enjoying what I do better than what else is out there, there might be some idea that maybe I know what I'm doing, or there's at least some kernel of truth to the approach that I'm taking, and that can be used as a sort of thought process of why you might consider me for a hire, even if I'm not. So this might sound like it's just me being salty about not being hired, but I still feel like this is a deeply common experience that a lot of people have, is if they don't meet these seemingly very specific criteria of you've done, shipped X number of games, or you've, done X number of, years in, and you have this degree, this diploma, when the fundamental aspects of that hold those up, the university that gives you the diploma, or the publisher that handles the game that may have created a very bad environment for you to actually show what you're capable of, when all of these things are sort of falling apart and anemic, as you said earlier, how much value can you even put into those credentials? So that's where I'm coming at this topic of conversation from. But I'm interested in your perspective. Obviously, you've been around within programming a lot longer than I've been around in my sector. So maybe you've experienced even more cases of this. Maybe you have a slightly less dismal view than I do on this particular subject. So how would you go about tackling the topic of credentials and how to build a better system that actually reflects how expert people actually are, whether or not they are experts?
So I guess I would say I don't think there is an easy answer to this question, and I would say that what you are experiencing, what you're talking about there, is you are literally experiencing the fact that we don't actually know how to do this. I don't think it's a case of people being, willfully bad at hiring. I do think HR departments are a bit of a joke, but I don't think it's the case that there's some obvious thing they should be doing and then they're not doing it or something like this. the fact of the matter is that if you take a look at something like the game industry, lots of people want to be game designers, and so they have a choice of candidates. So many candidates potentially that they don't really know how to figure out which ones they're even going to have in for an interview necessarily, let alone hire. Now, if you look at the way the world tends to work, typically what happens is that employers will then use artificial metrics which do not directly correlate with anything in particular, but have some marginal correlation with a better candidate. It is not true that all good candidates for game design went to college. It may be 10% more likely that a candidate who went to college is a better candidate than one who didn't. So if you're going to have to call 500 of your 600 applicants, you will do that because you got a 10% better pool than if you'd flipped a coin, right? So this leads to the fundamental problem of credentialing, and we have it everywhere. And that is that employers are using a marginal signal, a signal that's very small, but is probably there. It's unfair to people who are actually good but don't have the credential, right? But for the employer, that's the most expedient thing for them to do, that's efficient, that does guarantee that some of the people they discarded actually should have been, instead of just pure random, because that's what they would have done otherwise, randomly pick someone to call in, right? Now, this kind of a system actually works quite well at the beginning of the system oftentimes. I am sure that at some point in time, a degree in English literature meant you knew something about English or literature. And if you wanted somebody, or journalism would be another example, probably a great, but more one we have more familiar with, let's say. There was probably a time when someone with a degree in journalism was very likely to be a reasonable journalist. Probably when Columbia Journalism School started, that was close to the truth. And probably some of the people there who taught the classes knew something about journalism. The problem is, they then establish a pattern that you can rely on a degree from Columbia Journalism School to tell you that somebody is a journalist. That won't last. Now that the important part is the degree, not the thing the degree actually certified, the system will degrade because there's no weeding out process. Eventually, you will get to a point where Columbia Journalism School cranks out people who know nothing about journalism but still have the degree, and there's a huge hangover between when you see that effect in industry and the people still doing hiring from their collapse. It's been decades of garbage journalism that happen in between, right? So fundamentally, humanity has a credentialing problem, and the credentialing problem is almost a paradox. It's not paradox. It's a conundrum, if you will. It's that as soon as a credential becomes valuable, it actually becomes a problem, because not only will people seek to maximize how they get that credential, whether they have the things the credential shows them or not, but also the people delivering that credential will not have to actually provide the value anymore. Because as long as they can stamp that stamp, the person's going to get hired, right? There is no solution to this problem that I know of. People doing hiring have to someday fundamentally switch to an actual measure of people's ability to do jobs and ignore where they went to school, what they got for grades, where they grew up, their demographics. As long as they are still using proxies for quality, we will constantly suffer this degradation over time. And I don't know that there's any solution to it other than moving the test up the pipeline.
Another interesting aspect that's related to this is specifically if you just look at hiring. So you've got in the door, they've decided to consider you for an interview. You go into this job interview, and if you're a programmer, you are sometimes given this random problem that like you've got no idea how to solve. And so you have this this mock interview that you've done with Sean McGrath, I believe, on your YouTube channel.
Yes.
And one of the things that was really interesting when I was listening to this is I mean, in some ways, it follows a similar kind of pattern to like what you and I did before we started the recording process. You know, we just talked a little bit. We had tried to establish some rapport, and maybe it was a bit easier because you probably watched that Jonathan Blow interview, so you kind of know like my style a little bit. But you know, we hadn't talked at all beforehand, so this is like an opportunity for us to do that. So it's kind of similar in some respects to that, even, but after that falls away and you've established the rapport, you go into some specific questions about the applicant's history and what they've done as their career. Do you think that something like this is actually a good test to sort of fit the bill of what you're talking about? Because now you're still dealing with the fact that you might have weeded out the best candidate, in air quotes, or one of the best candidates before they even got to the interview process. But if we just assume for a moment, for the sake of argument, that say you just interview everybody who comes in the door, which obviously isn't tenable at scale. Do you think that an interview of that style, where you are actually asking them to show that they know what they're talking about, that they have experience in the realm that they say that they do, and that basically their CV and their resume can be backed up with the facts of what they can demonstrate? Do you think that is a good solution, or something that could be workable, or at least would solve that particular aspect? Because we are talking specifically about programming, but could you find an abstraction, a way to take that concept and move it across all of mankind's issues with hiring specifically, or do you think it's a little bit too niche to programming specifically?
Well, I would say that it's niche to technical things, perhaps. I don't know that it has to be specific to programming. I would say a couple things about that. So one is, again, this is sort of a second stage thing. So I see the credentialing problem as being more about step one, which is that if 1,000 people apply to this job, we can't interview 1,000 people this way. It would take all of our programmers all of their time to do these interviews, right? So even if we trained them all really well about how to do a really great interview, there's just not the time. So the credentialing process is a problem whether or not you have a good step two. I do think that kind of interview style is very important. I credit it to Chris Hecker. I think I say that in the actual video. But I've since heard that like a lot of famous people also use this interview, who don't even know Chris Hecker. So Elon Musk, I think, said this is how he does interviews, and maybe Joel Spolsky said it too. I don't think I'm the only person pushing this, and it wasn't my idea. So obviously Chris must think it's a good idea too. And then there's a bunch of famous people who apparently think it's a good idea. So I think it kind of naturally arises that if you've been through this a few times and you've seen how it goes and you've experienced it yourself when you've had an interview, you kind of know that the way to find out if someone knows what they're talking about is to ask them something they know about, not give them something they don't know about. Because fundamentally, I don't care what you can come up with in 30 minutes. No interesting problem I've ever encountered is really made progress on in 30 minutes. So I'm not hiring you to make progress in 30 minutes. I'm hiring you to make progress in a month on something hard. That's what I want to see. So I want to hear about you having done that. So that's why I think it's so much, because it puts the other person at ease. They could talk about something they know about. And depending on the skill of the candidate, I can scope it down. You know, if they're a very beginner, I'm not going to ask them to describe anything hard. Obviously, I'm going to pick easy things from their past, the easiest things I can grab onto to see how well they can dive into them, right? I think it's a great method. I wish people would use it instead of the whiteboard problem style. I don't think that's a good style. I don't think it tells you anything. I think there's lots of great programmers who would fail that kind of interview. And it doesn't match up to what people do in their normal life. You don't normally solve problems under pressure on a whiteboard. I don't know why that skill is interesting. Furthermore, I know plenty of people who do not make good programmers in practice who can do well at those interviews. So the opposite is also true. again, not much of an answer because I think, it's a good interview style. I think more people should use it, but I also think it doesn't really eat away at the credential problem. It would help things like stupid Google interviews, but it wouldn't really help the problem of how do you get an interview with Google in the first place or whatever, right? So.
Yeah, and the more I think about it, it also feels almost like in some ways it's necessary because it's a response to the fact that sometimes we have the wrong people for the job. And maybe they are really good at the whiteboard style interviews, but they're not going to add much value to the company. And so we have to filter those people out. And those people would be sort of less effective at hoodwinking somebody, we'll say, or just passing that test if we want to put it more neutral light. If the test involved actually showing their past experience in action and solving a problem over the course of a month or something to that effect, as opposed to in 30 minutes, like you said. So that's an interesting part of the whole problem. Is one of the things you mentioned about the credential angle is that there's, at the beginning of a university existing, it would actually mean something if you got the degree there. And now there's been a bit of a pretty marked collapse, especially in the example you gave of journalism, but just in general, as far as the educational system is concerned. I actually don't, I listen to a lot of people I would describe as serious thinkers, and I don't think any of them have positive things to say about the university in its current state, like the state of the modern university. And so I feel like that should probably tell the populace at large something. I mean, again, I don't know how far reaching some of their experience is necessarily, but it does feel like even some of these people are even professors or former professors at universities. Like they are the people who would have the most experience. If they are the ones who are saying, yeah, it's not very useful in X, Y, or Z field, and yet X, Y, and Z fields are still hiring based on those credentials, that lag time is like, maybe everybody's just caught in their own rat race and they haven't figured it out yet. But like you said, you can only engage in those really like long-standing interview processes that we talked about, if you have the people to do it. And I guess, as you said, maybe it's unique to technical things that something like that could work. But it does feel like, if we're going to shadow box briefly the idea of a solution to the credential issue, maybe instead of just going to a university and then getting a degree that says, oh, I went here for 4 years and didn't fail, maybe instead a solution could be that part of the university is almost like a workshop where if you're a journalist or you're studying to be a journalist, you actually write articles, or you conduct certain journalistic activities that would then show up in a body of work that could then be looked at by somebody who would hire you and say, oh, this person did this. And yes, that was during their time at this university. I don't know. We're definitely in the weeds of discussing this particular problem, but I'm curious as if you've shadowboxed in your own head, any ideas that might at least combat it, even if there is not any panacea single issue. Maybe this is even an unsolvable issue, broadly speaking, but are there any thoughts that you have about like ways to combat the problem of credentials as they are, where they're not really representative of what they claim to be representative of?
Well, so I think fundamentally credentials don't work. And the reason that credentials don't work is because, like I said, if you are relying on the credential, then you are by definition not providing the selection pressure that is necessary to maintain the quality of the credential. What I mean by that is, why was a Columbia Journalism School degree worth something to a newspaper that was going to hire you? Well, the reason is because it actually was producing good candidates somehow, either by selection or by training or by whatever. Other schools that offer journalism degrees didn't have the same cachet. There was obviously something that established that degree in the first place. That's selection pressure. The market selected for a particular credential out of many credentials they could have chosen. And that pressure is what produced the quality of that thing. We got the high quality one because we looked at who was coming out, and these were the people that were good. So that makes that credential be what is valuable. There was a tranche of them, and we selected one. Now what happens is, as we rely on the credential, now we're no longer selecting from a field of credentials and seeing that one of them happens to correlate with good candidates. So now the selection pressure is gone, and they can just attach that credential to any old random student that they kick out their doors, right? And because that selection pressure is gone, there's no system in place that ensures that it's good, right? Any system that doesn't have something ensuring it's good will become bad. That's just kind of how the world works. I'm fairly convinced that's just a law, right? Things decay over time if there's no pressure on them to reselect good outcomes. So to me, I just don't think there is a solution to that problem. I don't think there is. I think it will always decay. And the best you could do if you really had to have credentials is you just reset them. You reset to a broad field again, and then reselect to pick now what is the good school producing journalism candidates or whatever, right? But to me, that doesn't really get at the root of the problem. To me, the root of the problem is a university is a dumb idea, and you'd never do it today. It doesn't make any sense. That's my actual opinion on that subject. I think there's a lot of argument to be made for something like a university when we didn't have telepresence, when we didn't have the internet, when libraries weren't digitized, when people couldn't reproduce lectures, when people couldn't reproduce books. Like, there's so many reasons why you cluster education into a particular physical location that are now just a joke. None of them are true. They're all not true. And it's the reason why I get people saying, I literally have many emails of people saying, watching the first few episodes of Handmade Hero, I learned more than I learned in 4 years of university. Why? Because actually that's just a better way of educating. You take someone who knows the thing you want to do and you watch them do it, and you no longer have to go to a particular physical location to make that be true. So in my mind, universities are probably the single biggest societal problem facing us today. They are an entrenched, costly, ineffective system that is at the root of all major industries. It's like the biggest problem we face. And in my mind, the correct solution is to completely replace them. We need to build the decentralized education future so that everyone has equal access to it, so that it actually measures what students can do, and so that there's no, for lack of a better term, attrition signal process. If you read someone like Brian Kaplan, I think he makes a good case for the fact that what a lot of employers are really doing is just giving you a treadmill to run on for 4 years, because they know that people who can put up with a university for 4 years will be a more compliant hire for them than people who can't, right? That was sort of where that came from. So anyway, in my mind, I have nothing positive to say about that system. I think it needs to be completely replaced because I don't think it fundamentally does what we need it to do. It needs to be disaggregated into instruction and research, because right now it does both of those things, paradoxically, though they're not related. And I think it needs to focus the first part, the part that breaks off. The research part can go into industry, and we can find funding models for it that will move us forward. And the other part, which is the instructional part, we have to start taking really seriously. How do we really teach people to be good at the things they're going to do, not just give them these hoops to jump through for 4 years and assume that that makes a better job candidate that then has to learn everything on the job, which is what we currently do.
If somebody is listening to this and this is the first time that they've been introduced to this line of logic or this kind of reasoning, you referenced Brian Kaplan, I think. Are there other examples of thinkers who have maybe produced pieces about this, or anything that's influenced your thought process on this that you could refer to other people? If people were interested in doing a deep dive on what might be a replacement for a university, or what might be that decentralized education system, what are some resources you might direct people to, or is this something that you've mostly been thinking about internally and sort of away from other sources?
Well, it's hard to say. There's no shortage of people criticizing the education system, obviously. I mean, that's a thing that's been going on for quite some time. But what a lot of them tend to do is they kind of just want to replace our current crappy education pipeline with their new crappy education pipeline. And one of the big problems I have with that is that all of those changes usually end up being bad. Unsurprisingly, because the education system wasn't really designed, it just sort of occurred. And again, that selection process means the current education system at least does something. I don't think it's very good compared to what we could do, but it does something. And so people's pie in the sky ideas about like, oh, well, we'll do this and students have a problem because of this. It's like, it's all imaginary. Like they're just saying it, but we've never actually demonstrated that any of it is really true. Education research is absolutely dismal. I've read a lot of it and it's a joke. But that's not the same as saying we can't do a lot better. And so in my mind, I would say, if you want to read something critical of the education process, definitely start with Bryan Caplan. The Case Against Education is an easy-to-read book. It's not as rigorous as someone who wants the nitty-gritty is really going to want, but it at least gets you thinking about the broad ideas. But to me, I would say the same thing I just said about game design and about programming. It's not going to be somebody who has opinions about students or whatever else is going to say. Ignore them. They don't know what they're talking about. They're just making stuff up. It's going to come from us trying things and finding out what makes people learn. We're going to make new things online and with new technology, and we have to experiment and see what actually produces good programmers. That is the only way to do it, because by definition, our brains can't guess it's too complicated of a process. So what we need to do is be doing the experiments. We be trying things. One of the reasons I'm excited about Star Code Galaxy, even though I'm not an educator, is I'm excited to put something new out there and say, hey, how about these ideas? Do they work? And I'd like to see more people follow on to that. If they look at those things and they get inspired to try their own new different ideas, I would love to see them do that, because that's how we're going to find it. By exploration, not by, straightening our ties and giving our lecture about what's wrong with education. Because until you've built the future of it, you don't know, right? Like, you don't know what's actually wrong. So that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, a deep truth that I would take from that is the idea of not knowing how far away you are from what could be until you actually have the counterfactual.
Yes.
And there's so many examples of that. Like a more mundane one that I struggle with all the time is trying to convince people that the games that they currently play are very far from the games that they could be playing. And, it's not to toot anybody's horn specifically, but it's sort of like you have to think outside the box a bit and be in a more experimental research and development perhaps place than the average person ends up being. You have to operate in a different headspace in order to even start to imagine that the boundaries of the box are too small and they should be bigger, or they're made of the wrong material, or whatever criticism you might have. You have to explore that idea. Is it actually better if it's this way or that way? And then by doing that exploration, you actually get somewhere. So I do wonder why there's so much pushback. I guess it's part of the fact that, I've heard this analogy before, that the culture we currently inhabit is a behemoth ship, and it takes 8 years to turn it, or whatever, however long it takes to turn, in order to get it to go another direction, that, it's too far this way. You've got to really, steer the wheel, and it's going to take a while before it goes. That seems to be the case. So as far as, as long as we're talking about the idea of something related to culture, and specifically we were talking about education, perhaps something that you could trace back to the collapse of education or the general degradation of it is the state of modern discourse, and especially on social media. And something we talked about beforehand, before I even properly introduced you, in fact, was the idea of the, going back and listening to Supreme Court oral arguments and some of these other things that you like to do. And you consume that via podcast form. But I was interested in your, obviously, when you go to your YouTube channel, the comments are turned off, right? And then that's one example of you just deciding, well, I'm going to opt out of this because there's probably nothing of value. They places like YouTube and Twitter, they don't tend to foster great discussion. And as long as you're part of more of a niche enthusiast community, maybe that's not true. And maybe, sort of like socialism at a small scale, it might be able to work, right? But
right.
When was there a particular final straw that fueled your decision to just turn them off and just get rid of it? Or was it more like a growing sense that you're like, well, I don't really think there's much value in keeping them on, and so not much is going to be lost? What were your thoughts on that? Like the decision to just turn it off? Like how, first of all, I'm not familiar with how early on the decision was made. So you might be able to talk about that, but
pretty early, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't really know, but I guess there's a couple things.
Okay.
So in general, I would say that most people's opinions about programming are not interesting to me. Like, I don't think they're valuable. They tend to be kind of out in left field, and they've never really demonstrated any particular value to them or not. And I don't really find that I want to engage with those discussions because I don't see any value in it, and I don't even know what value they would see in it. There's plenty of places you can go to have those discussions, and you don't need to do them while people are trying to watch Handmade Hero. So in my mind, I'm just like, I don't know what the point of the comments on this thing even would be. Like, it's, if you want to go find people talking about, like, oh, should this thing be a member function or not, you can go do that. But that's what the comments almost always are. They're I think what people call bike shedding. So if in general, most of the comments on a programming YouTube video were like people actually commenting on important things you should know, like, oh, Casey didn't mention that, the 64K aliasing might be important here, and if you want to find out about it, here's this link. Of course I'd leave them on, but that's nowhere to be found. So to me, it was just like, this is not useful. It's just annoying. And I definitely don't want to be responsible for going and correcting a bunch of things that people might say that I think are like patently false, which could definitely happen. So I just don't tend to leave them on because I don't see being productive. I wouldn't trace that. I wouldn't necessarily link that to education in any particular way, though. Again, to me, I think education is more a systemic failing. I think to the extent that, the discourse is bad, I wouldn't say that the social discourse degraded and then universities degraded. It's the other way around. I would say universities degraded first. And again, they degraded first because there was value in having the title of professor, in being able to attach these credentials and that sort of thing. And as a result, what you get is people doing those things, not the actual underlying thing you wanted, which was being good at something or being good at teaching or be good at research that thing, right? If your metric is how many papers you publish, you'll get a lot of papers published. There might not be anything useful in them. Or they might be lies, which we now know happens all the time, right? Like, you will get the thing you measure. And so if the thing you measure isn't very closely related to the thing you actually want, this is what you would get. And I think that we've kind of seen that happen. And so, I don't think the discourse has much to do with it. And I think to a certain extent, you would probably make an improvement to the discourse if you actually fixed the university system by getting rid of it and replacing it with something that was much more equal access, much more focused on actually things that effectively teach people real skills we can verify. And I differentiate that to, like, there's a series of things taught in universities that are not actually skills. They're things people have claimed are skills to get themselves adjunct to the concept of a credential, but no actual reality-based verification of that skill could possibly exist. I'm talking about things like philosophy, English literature analysis, that sort of thing. These are things you literally cannot measure qualities of externally. So in a lot of ways, it's a lie. It's a self-reinforcing abstract system that really doesn't need to be something society credentials, right? It's, if you like this person's critique of Moby Dick, it was good. It doesn't matter whether some journal decided to publish that paper, because they don't have an abstract metric for good critique of Moby Dick. We have real metrics for computing. We know the performance of things. We know what the order complexity of a thing is. Like, we can actually measure things, and we have hope there. I don't fundamentally think, I think we should further disaggregate those things to skills that are real skills, and then other things which are, for lack of a better term, probably should be more market driven. And I think the internet's helping solve that too. Like, I don't think there will be such a thing as a credentialed English literature person in the future. They will be the people who other people find engaging when they go listen to their deconstruction of, some famous work of literature. Sorry, I picked Moby Dick. It's probably a bad example. But, the person who explains James Joyce well on YouTube and that people engage with, they are the value. Somebody who pompously asserts that because they're in a university, their interpretation is somehow important is not. So, that's just, I break down on that in a very, I'm sure, very controversial way, but I really do think that these are critical issues. What is taken care of by a market? What is taken care of by an education system? We have to actually be more serious about these. And the fact that we've been kind of not paying attention to them is causing huge problems for society on many levels.
So the connection I made between the educational system and the state of modern discourse was in part it was exactly like you said. It's like when the education system collapses, you get people who focus maybe on the wrong things, or they're just like overly fixated on things. And I mean, maybe that's going to happen anyway, but there's some degree of that that's informed by the fact that education is not in a good state right now. So I'm curious about, there's like a deeper thought, and I'm not really sure where I fall on this line, because like part of me really wants to say, oh, well, there's the freedom of speech side, and then there's like, you should be able to say what you want. And I'm pretty like, for the most part, I'm like, yeah, that's 100% the case. And then there's the other side of it, which is like, to what degree does it even make sense that somebody who's completely uninformed and also has probably no skin in the game of what they're discussing can come in to whatever I'm talking about and say, oh, you're wrong because of this, or just like maybe not even engage in the conversation entirely and say something that's just an insult or just something completely unrelated, right? So there are these two problems, and I'm pretty like mostly on the side of the idea that like, well, if somebody's like that, then I can just block them. And just like you said, like you can just turn off comments on YouTube or whatever. Like there's things that you can do to insulate yourself from that if you don't want to engage in that. But I do wonder what it says. I don't know if you've thought about this at all, but I'm curious about like what the reflection on society is right now, that there are so many people who essentially they've taken the internet and the internet's virtual water cooler, so to speak, where, you might talk about, a game that you watched between like a football game or something like that. You might talk about something that you yourself are not an expert at, but you still talk about it with other people who are also not experts. That's now been conflated with like you being able to just directly message or reply to somebody who is an expert or who has studied that for their whole life. And now you can say stuff that might be factually untrue, or, maybe somebody who is also an expert could argue for, but they would do it in a very different way than you're doing it. So like everything that you're saying is in some way suspect, right? And so like the example that I would often give in this context is that I also do analysis work within Counter-Strike Global Offensive esports, right? And so I'm constantly looking at like the top level professional teams, and I'm also breaking down like the game design decisions that Valve has done and how that impacts the teams and like where the meta switches and all this other stuff. And yet, so I've got like plenty of skin in the game because I'm trying to be a game designer myself. And then I also have just spent like ridiculous amounts of hours studying this game specifically. And I've watched all the games that I'm talking about. And then I make this point. But somebody who maybe didn't even watch the game specifically that I'm talking about, and certainly hasn't done any of the other things that I've done, can just message me or reply to my tweet and say, you're wrong because my favorite player is this, and you said he was bad or something. Like some dumb point that doesn't have any substance to it. What do you think? Do you think that that's even something? I'm not sure if you thought about that specifically, but do you think that that's even something that should be desirable? And should we just rely on other people to weed them out, like block them or turn off comments or whatever? Or do you think that there's some actual like can that system be salvaged where some pleb, for lack of a better term, who's uninformed can message somebody who is informed, and then, we run with that example? Because that has turned so many public figures, especially in esports, but just in any medium where you're very front facing and you are on broadcast all the time and you have to maintain a social media presence, that's turned a lot of those against their fans or against the viewers because they have to engage with what they view as very stupid, reductive opinions all the time. And that sort of poisons the chalice. Is there some way to salvage the discourse, the state of discourse, without essentially relying on people to just say, oh, you're a bad actor, blocked, or whatever? Is there some way to salvage that? Is that a problem you've thought of?
I mean, it is a problem that I've thought about, but I think one of the things that you have to be careful about is that there's more than one problem in what, like, there's a number of things that you're talking about. And one of the unfortunate things is people use the term freedom of speech oftentimes in lots of different ways, and they're usually not very specific about what they're talking about. And certainly this comes back to things like First Amendment concerns when you're literally talking about freedom of speech, like as is interpreted in the Constitution or something like that. But when we're talking more broadly about like just how do we organize conversations in society, I think freedom of speech is actually a typically very poor lens to look at things, because I think by attaching the important element of the right to the speaker, you make it seem like it's not so bad if they can't talk sometimes, right? Because the natural response to somebody would say like, well, I think everyone should have the right to speak is, well, what about, X or Y truly horrific person, right? And I think the problem with that is that is a much too facile way of dismissing what we're actually talking about. To me, what we're talking about is the opposite. It's actually the freedom to listen. So to me, the important freedom that I want preserved is that as an individual, I want the right to access any information that another person wishes to generate. That's, to me, also a fundamental concept of computing. It's a fundamental concept of many things, of open governance, of freedom of speech, of everything, all of those. To me, it's that freedom of access. A can produce information, B can get the information. That transaction is important mostly to B. It's B who I am most concerned about. It is my ability to hear what you have to say is actually much more important to me than my ability to speak. And the reason for that is because as a human living in the world, I listen a lot more than I talk. I talk a lot. I'm a talky kind of person. I don't know how long we've been doing this thing. And even I listen to way more speech than I produce. So I am probably at the high end. A lot of people would be even lower than me in their output to input ratio there, right? Is they're outputting even less and inputting even more. And so to me, the crucial thing is like people have to be free to get that information. So I look at it as a freedom to listen and a curation problem. What I generally want to see as we move into the future and hopefully create better technologies than Twitter or Facebook or whatever these first attempts are, I want to know that no one is being silenced. So whoever is producing information, I want to know that I can go and get it without some random person at Twitter making that decision for me, or some person in the White House or whatever country you live in, some censor deciding that person cannot post the information. I want to be able to get it. And then I also want strong tools available to everyone to produce curated sets of that information. I don't want every time I log on to see everyone shouting about everything. I don't think that's valuable. But the answer to that is not silencing the worst of them. The answer to that is providing ways that people can curate so that, again, I am free to listen to any individual if I decide they're important, and I can go to various curated versions of a thing to get what is a mostly pruned to my liking set of information, And I think if you have those two fundamental cornerstones, the ability to access anybody, but also the ability to tie into well-curated sets of information by, again, anyone who wants to do that, so the market would produce good versions of that, I think that's what I want. I fundamentally can't really put my head... I can't fundamentally empathize intellectually with people who literally want to tell me that if I want to hear what you have to say, but they don't think I should be able to hear what you have to say, that I can't hear what you have to say. It's a nonsensical point for me. So I understand that people believe that. I have heard some of the ways they try to express it, but I myself cannot understand that world. It's a world that's always seemed kind of alien to me, and I thought a lot of the things around, for example, freedom of religion fits well here. I thought we kind of agreed that, look, we are going to have these silos, and you're going to be a Christian, and you're going to be a Muslim, and you're going to be Jewish, right? But we didn't think it was that productive to then start shutting one of those down if someone thought it was the wrong idea, right? And it seems like we're kind of regressing. We're going towards a world where people want to start saying no, instead of building ways that people can form communities that is the things they want to hear and not hear the things they don't want to hear, which I'm totally okay with. We're starting to get back into that mindset of, no, there's a one thing you can hear and we have to get rid of all the rest of the things. I fundamentally don't understand it. So, maybe someday I should have a longer discussion with someone who really believes that, to try and get at where we can't come to an agreement. But fundamentally, I hope the future of technology is not about that. I hope the future of technology is more about a freedom of religion approach where we're building lots of different communities and you go to one where you feel comfortable. That to me seems way better than trying to prune the one community into something that isn't too offensive to anybody.
Well, yeah, I mean, the angle of taking the angle of whether or not something is offensive, I mean, there's so many different things that it could be, or so many different people who it could be offensive to, or there's so many different things that you might, like, essentially arbitrary lines that's true for one person but not for the other, like you were saying. And I think that approach, inversing it so that it's the freedom to listen, is a nice way of explaining the concept, in my opinion, because you get rid of the idea that, like, what if I'm listening to somebody who, you would think is condemnable? If I don't think that, or if I think that but still want to listen for whatever other reason, then surely I should have the freedom to do that, right? And so taking it from that.
Well, and I want the freedom to make the judgment. I mean,
Yes.
that's the other part about the freedom to listen. It's like, maybe I will come to the exact same conclusion,
Yes.
but I don't trust other people's judgment in place of my own very often. I want to make my own decision, and I feel like at the end of the day, freedom to listen is a better way to think about it, because I would hope that most people out there would rather trust their own judgment about who to listen to most of the time. And maybe that's not true, but that's the way that I think about it. And so that's why I think that any kind of censorship, whether it's governmental or corporate or any of those things, is not appropriate, but curation is. Meaning opting in to a system that does prune is very valuable. Once you've decided the kinds of things that you're interested in listening to, the kinds of things you aren't, you shouldn't have to listen to all these other things. I mean, I don't think forced listening is good either, right? So freedom to listen is very important, freedom to curate. And what I don't want to see is some universal curation, something that says that these sets of people never get to speak. So nobody can create a curation that includes their speech. That to me would be the most horrible outcome. And so I'm hoping it doesn't go that way in the end.
And that's where
it's
it
that
looks
way now.
like, yeah, it's
But,
where it looks like we are
but
heading specifically. I mean, if you only interact with certain web platforms like Twitter and YouTube, then you can't find, first party content from somebody like Alex Jones. You can only find maybe his occasional appearances before they get taken down elsewhere, right? That's like an example that a lot of people say, well, he's extreme and, we don't need to keep him. He can go, like, the fundamentalist approach to it of saying, like, if you sort of violate this principle, it doesn't really matter if I think he's a cool guy or if I think he's a great champion of whatever. If I think the same thing that you think, I still want him to be able to say something or somebody else to go find that something, right? And that's where I think it comes down to, right? And so if we're talking
about, to take that specific, let me take that specific example, because it's the freedom to speech for speech. I actually don't really care whether Alex Jones gets to speak or not. What I care about is that I get to listen to him and decide for myself whether I want to, right? And so the speaking is just a necessary precondition to get to the thing I actually care about, which is that I decide Alex Jones doesn't make any sense, not you. Right? That's the part that matters to me, is I decide when someone isn't making sense, not some corporation or some collection of other citizens that I didn't select. I want that choice. And furthermore, like I said, curation, core part of that, if there's someone who thinks a lot like me, then I want to be able to take that shortcut. If there's somebody who's like, this person seems to really pick the kinds of things I want to listen to all the time, that's a great way that I can sort of find new voices that I don't have to go through and listen to 50 Alex Joneses to get to the one guy that I actually wanted to listen to or whatever, right? So again, freedom to listen, very important to me. And it's not about can Alex Jones speak? It's that I made the decision that he couldn't speak. That's the thing that I want to preserve. And you can't preserve that if he never gets the chance.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just, there's a necessary precondition.
Right. And that precondition is obviously important because, I mean, like you said, other people right now are currently the ones who decide whether or not we get to listen to a certain person. Yes. I feel my personal take on that is that it's like the phrase bigotry of low expectations is thrown around a lot in other conversation topics than what we're talking about. But I feel like some of that is ringing true here, where they're almost by making the decision for us that this person shouldn't be able to speak to anybody. I'm not sure why they think that. Like, I'm not sure if they're justification. If you did sit down with somebody and you had a really long conversation with them and said, like, why do you think that you're the reason, like, you're the person who should decide, you're the censor who gets to put the stamp on and say this person's like untouchable now and shouldn't be able to talk? Maybe they would have some idea of like, oh, he's dangerous because somebody might think that he's right or something. I don't know what their justification is, but it feels like whatever it is, it's making an assumption that the other person who would be potentially listening to him is not equipped enough to, intellectually or ethically or whatever the case may be, to actually make the same decision themselves. And they don't even want to take a chance that somebody would decide to listen to this person. They're just going to say, no, you're not even going to get an opportunity. Just this person's unlistenable. I personally haven't engaged with a lot of the people who prescribe this, mostly because when you try to ask them to explain stuff, they usually run away, in my experience. They don't usually want to come to the table and have a talk, recorded or otherwise, about what the circumstances may be. It's an interesting conversation topic to me. It's an interesting conundrum because when you think about it for long enough, you start to realize, like, well, why are some other people making decisions for me? And now it's not even like that. It's even more dystopian because now it's an algorithm making decisions for who I can't listen to. Or the more technical term would be, the algorithm is giving me so much stuff that if I only look at what the algorithm provides, there are going to be some things that never get provided by that algorithm. And that the only way to find them would be to like brute force search it if I knew the exact keywords. And so stuff can just get buried algorithmically when you search for stuff that you won't really ever be able to genuinely find it on an organic sense. And so I'm not sure if you've thought too much about how algorithms are currently shaping discourse or currently shaping just any content discovery in general. But to me, it feels like a disturbing revelation I had is that a lot of people seem to just use Twitter Home instead of latest tweets. And they seem to just use YouTube Home instead of their subscription feed. And so even if they're subscribed to somebody or they follow somebody and they've tried to take the steps to curate their own content, what they get in their feed, they're not actually engaging with the best way to engage with that, right? They're not actually seeing, here are some, it's not even always recommending like, if you're on Twitter, for example, and you go to Twitter Home, it's not even recommending like the best tweets from the people you follow. It's recommending like stuff that they liked on their timeline. And now the people that they follow are being sort of shown to you, or maybe not even necessarily that they follow, which might be an argument for like, that could be one aspect of the curation, right? It's sort of like what you said. If you're following somebody who's really good at picking like good things that match up with your interests, then that should be something that gets shown. But that shouldn't be the only tool that you have. Like the fact that most people seem to just be deferring to the algorithm for their choices of what they consume. That's kind of disturbing to me personally, just because I can't really empathize with the same person who does that. But it feels like now, if you're given the power of what you choose to consume to something else, and you're allowing an algorithm to decide for you, there's going to be some element of loss that you incur without even knowing it. And it's almost insidious in that aspect. Do you think I'm being too doomsday about it? Do you think I have like too much of a negative, sort of perspective on it? What is your perspective on algorithms and how they sort of sort things?
I guess I would say that it's you may be conflating the downsides of algorithms with the downsides of only having one algorithm. So one of the problems, and this has been a theme through most things I've said, is there's no real selection pressure on algorithms to be good for you. The selection pressure on algorithms is to generate revenue, right? So fundamentally, the algorithms that are being deployed currently are getting tuned based on whether revenue is generated or not based on whether you got something from your feed that was beneficial to you. So again, I don't think algorithmic curation is actually a problem. I think the problem is we're not paying for it. I don't select or buy an algorithm. I am forced to use the one algorithm that is employed on the page that contains the content. They are merged. Like, if I want to view the tweets, I have to view the tweets using their algorithm. I get two choices, like you said, sort by date or magic that I don't know what it is, right? And it's no surprise that this produces negative outcomes for human psychology, because nobody is optimizing that algorithm for human psychology. I can't switch to a different algorithm because it makes me feel better today, or because I felt like it had better content, because I'm not having a choice. It's just, this is the one I get. And so I do think it's a problem, but I think it has less to do with the fact that they're algorithms and more to do with the fact that you just only have that one. And that one isn't even being optimized for what you want. So even if it was the only one, it has no reason to get better for you. I also think, this ties into a lot of the problems, because to the extent that things like freedom to listen are valued by the population, you have to provide public spaces where they feel comfortable and believe that they are getting information that's useful to them and all these sorts of other things. And if mostly what they end up with is an algorithm that shows them incendiary tweets from some random politician, well, that creates more difficult social environments to preserve certain freedoms, like freedom to listen as well. So, there's a lot of problems with the uniformity of what's being laid in place, because it isn't being optimized for our best interest, and there's no reason to suspect that it ever will be. So I share your concerns. I don't think they come much from the concept of an algorithm so much as that sort of singular, non-selective thing that is, the one algorithm you get.
Okay, so then the fear is more so it's like algorithm as a term turned into a boogeyman culturally, and now we're ascribing a lot of things that aren't unique to algorithms or don't have to come with algorithms to this one. It's just that's a feature set of this particular algorithm that is employed, or these ones plural, depending on the sites you're using.
I might go so far as to say that as scary as you think the algorithm is, I assure you that if it was actual Twitter employees picking your feed, it would be 10 times worse. They would be more biased, more insidious, more, obviously trying to manipulate public opinion than any algorithm probably ever will be. So again, in my mind, I think it's that unity. I mean, you have to remember, what's the reason we even have freedom of speech largely allayed against the government as a thing that we enshrine to the Constitution? Well, it's because the government's very powerful. That's the reason we care about that particular protection. Freedom of speech in the Constitution was against the federal government because states didn't want them to do anything insidious with it. That's what it was there for in the first place. These corporations are in similarly powerful positions. It's why we should care, because they have the power. If Twitter had 500 users, no one would care if they were censoring people from the platform or if their way of curating feeds was lousy. So really, what we care about these sorts of freedoms, the freedom to shape our own, to do our own curation, to choose who we listen to and not, it's important when people accrue too much power. And it's obvious to me that these platforms have. So it's about that. It's not about private corporation versus public. Those are legal issues. In terms of what you should care about, the freedom to listen on the main places people speak. That is what you should care about, and we obviously don't have it right now, and it's an issue.
We've covered a huge amount of topics in this interview, and I wanted to extend you an opportunity to say any final words. And before I do that anyway, I wanted to thank you for spending some of your very valuable time this Saturday talking about all sorts of different things with some guy on the internet. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I don't think I have any other things to say. I would just point out in the end that, you talked about blockchain a little bit. We touched on cryptocurrency, and then we talked about like freedom of to listen. And we didn't get to this when we talked crypto. I just add the one thing on the end of that, which is that one of the reasons that I was interested in cryptocurrency as well is because sort of philosophically, I agree with sort of the good actors in this. There's plenty of scam artists in crypto and all kinds of financial shenanigans, and I don't want anything to do with that. But there are people who are working on what they call Web3, right, is their buzzword, who really do care about decentralization and censorship resistance. And as much as I don't know how much I believe blockchain is really quite the solution people think it is, I like the fact that there is momentum behind that concept. And so whatever else you might think about blockchain, and I am somewhat pessimistic about it, I hope the movement succeeds somehow. I don't know if this technology is what it is, and I'm worried that it might not be very good. But decentralization and things we can do to increase that diffusion of power, I think help us in a lot of places, and not the least of which being the topic that you ended on, which was freedom of speech, or as I say, freedom to listen.
We at the No Frauds Club thank Casey Muratori for his time, and we invite you to exercise your right to listen by subscribing to the YouTube channel and sticking around, seeing where we go in our journey to provide quality video games to an otherwise starved populace.